And here we go. Welcome to Great Train Layouts Live. I am your host, Nick Oserak. Thank you for joining me as we build yet another virtual train layout in Trainz with a Z Railroad Simulator 19. Excuse me. Good to have you with us this evening. I am joined by my cat, Luca, who is sitting off screen, looking out the window. And it's good to be joined by you for a Delaware and Hudson branch line. This is a track plan designed by Rob Chant of Journal of Model Railroad Design, also known as JOMRED. His website, I encourage you to check out because he has a load of good plans there, which if you become a member and it's free, you can see literally hundreds of designs. This is actually a New York Central branch by design. He called it the East Brook branch, but we are giving it a D&H slant because here on Great Train Layouts Live, it is Shark Week. This is not a shark. This is my cat. This is Luca. But I don't have a shark. Yet. But we'll have two sharks that we'll be playing with once we build this train layout. So, hello NKP or NPK765, man. Good to see you back. So we'll get into what this design is and what the thinking behind it is. So this is an HO scale 9'8" by 9'10" shelf layout designed for point-to-point operation. As you can see, I did kind of cheat. I don't know if you call it cheating. I hold myself to a much higher standard. You guys are so flexible and understanding, which I always appreciate. You know that I like to build everything on camera, and we're going to be building just about everything, but you also know that I don't like wasting my time having to go shopping, as I call it, for buildings, and this is a track plan with a lot of buildings, and so rather than take up time just trying to find the right city buildings and flavor, I did that off camera. But everything else we're going to be doing tonight to explore what kind of a switching potential one gets with a layout like this, and especially when you're designing a switching layout where you can be a little bit more flexible on the size of equipment that you're using. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. I'm more than happy to answer them as we go along. I also encourage you to stick around because we, other than, of course, watching what we're going to be doing, we have a secret, special, surprise guest that will be joining us today. Somebody who actually knows a lot about the subject at hand. I don't want to give too much away, just in case somebody might guess who that might be. But he's worth it. Trust me, he is absolutely worth it. So, with that said and done, if you have any audio issues, trouble hearing me, just let me know that too. So, let's get underway with the track. So, beginning with our little game of connect the dots. This is why I love Trainz with a Z from a layout planning standpoint. Look at how perfectly this track lines up with the lines in the plan. So this plan, designed by Rob Chant, he uses a software called Third Planet, 3RD PLAN IT, which is layout design software by design. And when I say layout design software, as in it is intended to be, it is intended to be used for planning train layouts. I always like to say that with Trainz with a Z, I've cracked the code, or many people have cracked the code, but I've figured out how to use it for layout design purposes, but recognizing it works best in tandem with another program. When I'm designing track plans, I use a program called AnyRail because of the fact that you can create infinitely flexible track that trains will go around in the sim, but not real life. So we know that this is an accurate track plan by way of it being designed in a software where it's working with actual track, so forth. And then we use a program called Base Maps imported into the game. I was actually asking N3V, the developers of this game, because they hold a monthly Q&A session. I was actually asking them about the possibility that in the future we could get some type of built-in program to be able to do this, and they said that they want to have APIs available in the future for developers, which would make it easier to integrate, but not likely to have actual planning, well, not planning software, but track plan or map importer. So for the foreseeable future, this is the way to do it. But it's also something that I've spent enough time with to kind of get used to. Alrighty. Hello, John. Hello, Mean Metal Mike. Check out Watkins Glen, New York, and the Finger Lakes Railways. Two customers, U.S. Salt, being a request for a layout. You could research it. Yes. Well, the thing with this is that there's always going to be more subjects that I can research when it comes to prototype railroads that I'd love to model in the sim. But good to keep those in mind. So we are going to add, we need to add an adapter piece. So this plan accounts for a 100-foot turntable. Interestingly, no roundhouse, but you have a 100-foot turntable. The plan calls for having a sanding tower and a water tower and a coal tipple. We're doing this as 1970s D&H. So Steam was 20 years ago, and I'm kind of envisioning it as like end of branch line type thing, but not meriting the full facilities. So that's why we're gonna have a water tower. So if you wanted to run excursions like Reading 2102 when it was disguised as D&H 302, you have the ability to do that. But not full facilities. That said, if you were doing it branch line area, you totally could add more facilities as you see fit. That's just kind of a matter of prerogative. There's my adapter piece. We're putting an adapter piece in so that we can move that and connect it to the table. Like, yep, there we are. So we'll get that track. I hope you guys have been having a good month. I appreciate those of you who tuned in last month when we were playing around with my own layout, my real life train layout based on Greenfield Village. That was a fun little project. And being able to show that off in the sim and talking with Frank DiStefano about the Brooklyn and Flushing Railroad or Flushing and Brooklyn that he is building or has built. 1830s railroading at its finest. So now we've gone modern. I wanted to go a bit modern this week. John Rizzo, you're surprised that Trainz still works. It does, although this is actually Trainz 19. I do have Trainz. It does still work for me as well. But admittedly, I only use it if I'm trying to import things from, let's say, Trainz 12, and I need an intermediary step where some assets work in pain, but not in. It's not something I frequent a lot. Don't find myself going back to it. 19 for me is stable enough, has the features that I'm looking for. That is what I tend to go for. I did try 22 a little bit because I was helping a couple months ago Steve Barry, the editor of Railfan and Railroad Mag, get familiarized with Surveyor 2.0 and Trainz Z22, which was a very interesting learning experience for me because Surveyor 2.0 is very different from what we're playing in today. Similar and yet different. Other than that, I have not played around with it much and don't necessarily have a strong desire to at this point. Hey, Mr. Railyard, good to see you. Glad that you could join us tonight. Now this is the scene. You know how there's certain scenes that I come into these streams going, this is the scene I'm most excited about. Well, that's close enough. This scene over here is the one that I'm excited about tonight. Wausau. I might reskin that to change the name partially because I just don't know how to pronounce it. So this station's on a curve, and as originally designed, if we hide the root layer, you'll see it's designed to be a much smaller building. But I kind of wanted a big building. I partially because I couldn't find a smaller building that felt grand. I didn't just want a wooden structure. I wanted something that felt some degree of grand and proper. And so I found this, and I thought that feels D&H enough. And I like how it really sets the scene over here, to the extent that I'm not even including these houses that are in the plan. So we'll have to work on curving the platform and making that look like it's supposed to be on a curve. But that is tonight's showstopper scene, you know? At least in my book. That's the one I'm the most excited about. Got a number of industries here. This is one I will admit I wasn't, as I was coming into tonight's stream, thinking about it late last week, early this week, wasn't 100% settled on what I wanted to do. But when I was looking through my track plan database, which is just this spreadsheet of all these track plans that I look at and say, well, someday I want to do that. Looking through, and I came across this one that I bookmarked of Rob's, and I knew I had to be building this because I'm really excited about the switching opportunities it presents, and especially switching but not cramped switching. Sometimes I like cramped switching, like dockyard scenes, that kind of thing. It's not what I'm in the mood for. What I'm in the mood for is switching with bigger locomotives, or more specifically in this case, a pair of locomotives. That's more what motivates me today. And so that's what we're doing. And I'm so glad that you can be along for the ride. Quick shout out to those of you on Patreon who are supporting these creative endeavors. I really appreciate that. And if you are not, you could go to patreon.com/theroundhouse, where you get early access to Roots. Up next, and I didn't get it online for when I'm streaming this live, but when you watch this on repeat, it'll be on there. The East Broad Top layout that we built a couple of weeks ago, or months ago, I should say, that is going to be uploaded to Patreon for supporters first for a month before it appears on greattrainlayouts.com. So if you want early access to that layout, absolute blast to build, then I urge you to support the Roundhouse Podcast, Great Train Layouts Live at the Rail Yard. I've got an announcement to make about that too. And that is the place to go and do that. So thank you to those who are. And also, if you like what you see in terms of my approach to building these digital train layouts, and think this would be really helpful for me with building my own layout, I do take commissions. You can go over to Great Train Layouts Live, or not live, greattrainlayouts.com, and get in touch with me through that. I do take commissions, and I'd be more than happy to help you to make your vision a digital reality, to make it a full reality. I think that is most of the track that we need. Not all of it. Let's see if I've missed any segments. Oh, I have. This switch here. Yeah, this is a trick little one. I had to practice with that one. I think I got it on the first try. Yep. Okay. Now I think we have all our track in place. We're gonna turn off the map layer just so we can look at. Yes, yes, I win today. Sometimes I turn it off. It's like, oh, I've forgotten one or two strands of track. But not today. Today we have what we want in. So now we get to start looking at scenes. We've got buildings, and so we get to start looking at individual scenes. And the key with a small space like this is making everything feel like there's some distance and separation. You're talking shorter trains. I mean, obviously one could always extend this and do a full loop if you had the room, but treating it for what it is, you're only going to have trains that really you could probably fit in that runaround, which isn't actually that small. That's a pretty sizable runaround, but they need to fit in the runaround for one thing, but also you have to figure that you're, from a switching standpoint, you're probably getting everything into sidings and industries along here. We might put a couple of cassettes off the end here and here, because the original track plan, this is actually a buffer at the end of the original track plan. This is a cassette, so you can have trains going in and out. I don't quite know what I want to do on that particular front yet, so we'll see. We'll just start doing some scenery and having some fun with that. And I think we'll kind of go around, and we'll start from this junction and we'll work our way around the city, because this could get detailing heavy. I want to see how long it takes. Oh, I have my mouse turned off. That's right. I wonder why I have my mouse turned off. I'm not wondering. I know exactly why it's turned off. Although I should be capturing the cursor. There it is. Okay. I had turned it off, though. There was a reason for that. Mr. Railyard, what locomotives do you think would look great for this layout outside of the D&H? Excuse me. It really depends on what kind of theming you give it. So if you gave it this same kind of Northeast railroading theming, I mean, you could put Jeeps, you could put Alcos, and even some like G44 tonners, that kind of thing. A lot of directions you could take that. To map out the edges of this, just to kind of, so I don't get too caught up in going too wide on the fascia. Black tone. Yep. Here. Good to have some guidelines, because otherwise I'll get caught up in making the scene too wide. So this is one of those things that when people make layouts in Trainz, some include fascia and make it look like a model railroad, some don't. I started by making my layouts look like real worlds that just happen to have these big forests kind of separating them. I have a couple of layouts that have yet to see the light of day that I want to do that with, but admittedly, it's not enough. I lean more heavily into the aesthetic of this is a model railroad. That's more my preferred look these days. Now we're going to set all of the heights to, or negative 9.9, just because then we have our guidelines. Here's where things go out of the world. But yeah, to fully answer your question there, Mr. Railyard, I think there, so much of it depends on kind of what industries you have, ergo what type of power you would need to have. You would need to have to pull trains to service those industries, but I think any switcher is going to look a-okay. I mean, even steam era. And that's kind of part of the idea with this layout, is even though I'm building it with the sharks in mind and with the diesel era in mind, if I wanted to put on my Canadian Pacific D10s, I think that they'll fit. This layout screams for a single Alco end cap switcher or G7010. Agreed, Rudy. If only we had those. Well, yeah, we do have Alcos. So just to kind of give up a quick look at what that would look like. So this is the Alco S2 that I have on handy. This is Diamond River Mining. So mining Alco with ditch lights, so not quite the same vibe. But yes, totally agree with you on that. It's very much a Alco-friendly place. And I do have an Alco we might be playing with in a bit. Mean Metal Mike, Strasbourg Railroad layout would be cool idea. Interesting you say that. Watch this space. And what classic railroads did I get hooked into earlier? Canadian Pacific, Canadian National. If it was Canadian, that is what I got hooked on thanks to my dad. That very easily on that front. Okay, I want to put down a base layer of grass, and then we're going to kind of layer everything on top of that. So this is kind of a grass-dirt combo. I feel like on this, I'm going to want to go very, very woodsy, very dark grasses with the, with our build with the Minnesota Northern. That was a bit lighter in color, but this, I want to go with dark greens. Bits of mud here and there, that kind of thing. And we're going to mix up the different types of grass so that it doesn't look totally unified and tiled. We'll have to add some bits of dirt as well. So let's just focus, we're going to focus first on what I'm calling a scene, which is this part, which is our junction up to about here. We look to the plan for guide. Basically, we've got our buildings in place, just need some forest in here to really kind of create a sense of separation. I'll turn this on because I keep forgetting that these buildings are going to get cut off, so what I'm going to do is add IDS forest backdrop. And let's see how I like the look of that. Oh yeah, that's woodsy. That is woodsy. And this will be a way of just kind of, sort of like with the fascia, reminding us these are barriers of the layout. This is where we hide the scenery in the back to where that it doesn't, so we can kind of use the buildings we want. There we go. Already, it's looking very woodsy. It's also looking very uniform, which is why we're going to add more trees. CNR 060 or 260 would be perfect for the layout. Yeah. That I can actually go. Yep. Yeah, I like this engine a lot. I really want to get one of these in brass at some point, because this is... I'm more of a CP guy than a CN guy, and I'll bring up a D10 just to prove that point, and prove that it fits the vibe of what we're creating as well. But I just love the like, that is just a perfectly dimensioned switcher. It's big and chunky, but it doesn't feel grotesquely large like some 060s and some 080s. I like the tender, like that is just a nice switcher. So yes, totally with you on that. But the D10 also has a place at home here. So this building, it's going to need a platform. We're going to need to give it a foundation. See if I want to turn it around. So if there's shipping doors on the outside of this. There are not. I might play more around with that after the fact. But I'm going to put a platform here for now. This is going to be a one-night stream build I have it in my mind, so ergo, I want to take up too much time of things. Feels like We'll see what we can get done tonight, and the rest will probably be off camera. Unless you really like it and want me to do a second night of it, but we'll see what kind of progress we make. That's sort of why I chose the buildings in advance, too. So we could just kind of emulate. I think that's supposed to be a warehouse. Let's get some STRMM in here. Going for a very woodsy, very northeastern, very woodsy look. Could you do this as Southern Pacific or Santa Fe in California? Absolutely. And I probably should do more with those western roads at some point. That is definitely oh, I'd like to do something there. It's partially having the right plan. There is a Santa Fe Midwest line I'd like to do, but obviously Midwest we've covered recently, so that's something I'm not looking to get back just yet. Okay. Just here like that, yeah. Just to create a sense of depth. And probably super detailing this more. I know that I always hit that 9 o'clock, which is our playtime, and I'm like, oh, just one more thing, and it keeps kind of dragging out. So I'm really going to try to cover all the territories first, and then worry about coming back and super detailing. Foreground here, let's put some sawsness. Let's put some, not sawsness, coasts. Just to give a sense of depth. Elk. Like that, but not that big. Ooh, that's kind of... The key is to remember, this is a switching area, and I do like to treat it as if one actually had to keep in mind about reaching over and around things. Oh, some power lines. Yeah, we're going to need power lines. Yeah, we'll put some tough grass here, some back there. Because the goal is to be able pre-visualize what we have going on. We want to be able to see what is this all for? What is this all about? What is the meaning of life? Why are we building train layouts and not gardening? I don't know. Well, actually, I do garden. Too. But this is my digital garden. This is my digital life. And you're part of it. And I appreciate you being part of it. You also get to be part of my random musings and contemplations. And it's so good to have you along for all of that particular kind of fun. Yeah, I like how that looks. That's looking legit. Looking nice. Feels good to get back to these eastern routes with all their trees. Power lines are the Rudy Gardley. Best foreground scenery for a switching layout. Make sure they're directly in the way of all ground throws. Exactly. But let's say it makes more sense for them to be over there than over here. But we don't really shoot that. Especially some old telegraph lines too. Power, telegraph, that kind of thing. We'll get to that later. And we're also going to replace all of the ground throws. Speaking of ground throws, with my own homemade Caboose Industries ground throw, specifically scaled to HO in this sim. I do not consider myself a 3D modeler for the most part. I know enough with Blender to be dangerous, but not comparatively to some of the art that we see on here. But I know enough that I was able to make that ground throw, and that was fun. So it's really fun to be able to be like, hey, throw the Caboose Industries ground throws. I even made them with color, so you can flip them, and then I should show with this. So you place one, and you can see that it's green for the main line or red for the reversed, normal reverse. You know what I mean. Mean metal mics. This could be a British Columbia Canada setting with logging. It could. I would love to do a logging line. We did Sandy Fork last year, never finished it up, and I don't know if I might finish it up if I want Surveyor 2, and the high definition terrain stuff is more stable in 22, because there's a lot of sudden grade changes on or that like landscaping, and I wasn't happy with how it was looking here in 19. So that is I'd love to come back to it kind of thing. Oh, I don't want that there. I definitely want to come back to that, but I'd also really like to do a modern logging railroad, especially something with the Eagle River Eagle River logging, which is a jointed rail product, because Steve Laro had some steam locomotives that fit for it. So yeah, I'd love to do a modern logging railroad. Could you do logging with this? Yes and no. The thing with logging is you need to keep in mind that you're transporting whole units of things. So a scene like this, I mean, I suppose you could make that your log dump or your logging sort yard, and you're picking up cars from offline and from a camp. Yeah, that's how I would adapt this. I don't think it's ideal, but I think you could make it work for a logging railroad. That I do think. Case. That's part of the art of reading track plans, is reading between the lines. So there's what's literally on the page as far as what the creator has envisioned for a railroad or a time period, but then there's thinking outside of the box of, well, what if I changed the era? What if I changed the country? What if I changed on that? There is absolutely value to that as an approach, because then you open yourself up to so many possibilities. Last year I started reading Railway Modeler magazine, and I bookmarked a number of track plans, that some of which I want to do as UK track plans, because they're pretty much exclusively UK. But also I did make note of some that I looked at and thought, okay, that would make for a good American design. I could see how I'd do that. Gonna need to work on that, but that works for now. So this is our second scene that we're moving into now, which is an intermediary town. This is where I think we could really get away with putting more as far as trees are concerned, because I want to give the sense that this is the same town, but not, oh, look, I can see my train all in one fell swoop kind of thing. So let us, maybe I want to do more elk trees. Because I did like how those looked. And they are really tall and scenery dividing. I mean, yes, I am putting them right in front of switches, but I also think that I'm putting them in front of switches that you can easily work around. And I'm also some of those in the backdrop, because I'm realizing variety there, but I like the darker color. Oh yeah, that's making me happy. That is making me very, very happy. I like having a variety of color and greens. Yeah, that's pretty good. Need to do some ballasting with that, but I feel like we're going to need to do that across the whole board, so we'll come back to that. Hello, it's Trainz time. It is indeed Trainz time. Rio Grande narrow gauge. Would that work with this map? Maybe. I confess, I do not have a great amount of knowledge of Rio Grande operating scheme and the, as far as what does and doesn't make sense. Okay, improv time. So I want to do a thing. And I think I'm going to do a thing. So what's the thing I'm going to do? We don't have any bridges on this layout, and I kind of want to make a bridge. And I want to make it here. Just a little something. Because I like bridges. I'm going to do a trestle. Just a little wooden trestle. Not a huge scene stealer, but just something that makes me go, okay. Let's see if that's going to work for our Probably not. None of those have, or does that appears underneath? Yeah, I'm not sure this is my best option, but I will take it for now. I'm gonna build it above ground. And then I'm gonna sync it to track level, just to make sure that I like how it looks as a trestle. Yeah, just a little something. And then I don't even know if I want to, maybe like a tiny creek. Not a big roaring thing, but a tiny little creek that could kind of quietly disappear off to the side there. Just to give a little something scenically before we get to the coal mine over. I'm also inclined to do a little bit of landscaping, just to make the coal mine a little bit more separate. Because to my way of thinking, yes, you've got cars in here, but you're not going to need to sort them. This is where you need access. And you have access here for being able to uncut and assemble full cuts of cars. I don't think you really need to get back here. So I think that there's something to be said if we can make that separate so that it feels really removed from the rest of the scene. That to me seems like the way to go. I mean, this tower is still kind of dominating the landscape. I'm not crazy about that, but I'm not quite sure what I want to do on that front yet. For all of the many assets that do exist for Trainz, there's not a ton of mines. The ones that do exist are often really big. I might do some Microsoft Train Simulator importing, try to get some take a building and size it to what I want to make it a little smaller, because that's just a bit weird. Oh, and that's a bit tall. I don't want it to be that. What was it? Just kind of, oh, we have something to block us off from there. That feels right. Okay, there we go. Hello, White Star. Hope you're having a good one. Well, I hope you're having a good one too. Good to have you with us tonight. So we're gonna go about lowering this, doing a little bit more landscaping, I think, just to. I'll need to replace that with trestle track too. Right. Really small creep. What we're going for. Probably do stones and that. Yeah. So. I'll ask this now, because we're not yet signing off or anywhere near it, but anyway, that's good. In terms of what you'd like to see in future stream, I'm always open to your thoughts, and do let me know, especially if you're watching live, what you'd like to see as far as subjects, specific layouts, or types of layout designs you'd like to see me cover. Some that I'm going to throw out there as potential future subjects I'd like to cover include the Arcade in Attica. So somebody mentioned the Strasbourg Railroad. I have an Arcade in Attica track plan, which is pretty much done. It's like 99% done, so that would mostly be for the sake of playtesting. But if that's something you'd like to see, that's one option. But also in terms of era, you want to see more modern, more mainline, more backwoods, logging, switching, mining. Because I always feel like I might skew towards my favorites, especially when it comes to short lines and small railroads and so forth. And I want to make sure that I'm covering things that are actually of interest to you guys. So if there's specific things that to you, then do let me know what would be of interest in that regard. Yes, I do have that. Oh, I forgot that I actually have trestle. I went to the trouble of finding that bridge asset. Oh, we'll make that work. We'll delete that. Because that'll look even better. It does. Yep, I like that. And then we'll find a little river set that we can use. For some reason, this is reminding me of the South Coast Pacific Railway. I'll have to take your word for it. I'm not familiar with that. I suppose it might be having a bit of a Pacific Northwest vibe to it, even though that's not exactly what I'm going for, but I will say that, okay, so one of the things I'll let you in on, because we've got a couple of super secret surprises coming throughout. So, one thing that I will let you guys know, since you're tuning in, is I am pleased to say that At the Rail Yard is coming back for an episode. And I always put it as for an episode because I don't know how. I always say it's not going to be a frequent thing, and I don't want to make promises of how frequent it will be. But I am working on a review of the Shasta route by train simulations for open rails. So At the Rail Yard is coming back for an episode. And no guarantees on when it'll come out, hopefully within the next month. But that's something that's been... And so the Shasta line, speaking of Southern Pacific, so I will be very heavily into Southern Pacific territory with that one. Yeah, that'll work. I'd even put some rock down for that. One of the JR rocks might work to my liking, or CL rocks. Yeah, the CL rocks would. Like that. It's interesting. So with Heiss, you've seen some of his latest stuff. You'll know that he and I are building these dioramas from Walters called Build a World kits, and those involve rock making. And so I'm just thinking about how easy it is to lay rocks in the sim versus in real life, where you have to pour plaster and so forth. That's why it's good to be able to test scenery ideas in the sim before you commit to pouring the plaster. Very messy business. So I feel like I've covered 3 things, but yes, At the Rail Yard's returning. If you're watching this in late 2023. Trainz time. South Pacific Coast was an early electric railway. Well, I'm always partial to my interurbans. Definitely want to do another interurban at some point here on the show, because I really love doing the Valley City Street. Okay, maybe a couple of bushes or pieces of grass, and then we'll keep it moving. Because, man, it's already coming up on the first hour, and it's like, yeah, I still have to get to the city. It is amazing how fast time flies on this show. All down to good company. Always fun having you guys along for the ride and for these builds. Yeah, now I'm looking at it, it's like, it really does have a... I think I'll probably have to lighten the grass a little bit, because it does make me think very Pacific Northwest. So if it is a matter of like, oh, let's put some grass down that a little bit more. Oh, that's not PBR. Lightens it just a bit. Then it's not quite as dark. I don't know. I do think our forests in the Northeast... That's what I get for living in Virginia this long. What does the Northwest, or what does the Northeast look like again? Where am I? Is mayonnaise in fact an instrument? And I think we might play around with the height of that a little bit just to not make it look so uniform and flat. Especially with these flat layouts where you don't have any grades. Good idea from a standpoint of you're making your construction life easier. You're making your track lane life easier. Key then becomes how do you make it look like a real world, and so that means sculpting terrain around your track. Port Hope. What is your favorite train game like Microsoft Train Simulator and Train Simulator Classic? I don't have a favorite one because so much of it depends on what I'm in the mood to do. Every sim has different pros and cons. So I've always sort of hesitated at the idea of the best or a best. Right now, Trainz is the one I spend the most time in. It is the most satisfying. Certainly from a route building perspective. But you know what? Having now spent more time in open rails because of this review that I'm putting together, I think open rails is very heavily underrated, especially when it comes to the length of runs that you get. That is a really impressive simulator, which is part of why I want to talk about it on the podcast, on the show, on At the Rail Yard. Run 8 for multiplayer. Railroader, which isn't out yet, but I'm part of the beta testing team for that, has some very interesting strengths. So it really depends on what you're looking for. So if you have questions about what you're looking for in a sim experience, I can direct you that way. Okay, now close to an hour in, close to having our mystery guest join us, and that's a good start of things. I like that. That makes me happy. I need a t-shirt that makes me happy, because I feel like that's, but it does. It's so satisfying when you put together a plan and you just see it come to life and you're like, oh yeah, that looks good. That looks good. And again, kudos to Rob Chant, the designer of this layout. I think this is a really creative track plan, a great way of being able to get a lot in a little. I have a feeling I don't probably want more grass and things, but I'm going to worry about that later. We've got a tank farm to build. Oh, I did forget a track piece. Oh, nappies. I did forget a track piece. Okay. Fix. Yes. Any guesses as to our mystery guess? Any guesses about might be coming on in just a few minutes to contribute to the conversation about the DNH and the sharks? This guest knows a thing or two. Port Hope, how do you do a Microsoft Train Simulator converter for route into Trainz a new era? You can't. Simple. You cannot. You have to build it anew. There's no easy way about that. So if you like something in MSCS and you want to see it in Trainz, be prepared to learn route building and do it. Simple answer to that. Tank farm, let's see. I kind of want to fence it off, so I'm going to look for a chain link. Tank fence. To give ourselves some boundaries. I mean, this is in brick, so I suppose I could do a brick wall kind of thing. You have a number of brick buildings. I should probably do brick walls. Just to come up with the right kind of new, modern, and clean. Yeah, I like that. I like that. We'll go with that. I feel like this layout could be called the brick house, because I was thinking about this as I was placing buildings down. There are a lot of brick structures, and that's just kind of the look that I wanted to go for and went for, and that's what we got. Wasn't exactly intentional, but now that I know that I'm doing it, I'm not shying away from the fact that I'm doing it. And I think we're gonna close that off here, or do I want to close it off like that? I don't know. Close it off like this. I think that probably makes... Or maybe part brick, part chain link fence? No. Our special secret guest is not Heis and PK. Good guess, but no. Mr. Railyard, favorite model from K&L Trainz? Probably this one. I haven't... It's so good. It's also on the list of I want to build a layout just to have something to do with this. This one. And we'll be spending more time with K&L stuff because I do have a build coming up that's kind of centered around Steam. I want to build a Reading and Northern layout just because I want to have a place to play with this. This is one of his newer models. It has the 3D cab, so even though not my favorite from a standpoint of like what I love, a favorite in terms of quality. Kitties. There we go. I am now joined by cat number 2, Mr. Alco. Say hi to Alco. He's a good boy. His full name is Alco Pone. Spelled P-W-N. And Luca's last name is Frazzi. So I affectionately refer to them as the Gangsters of Love. Yeah, this is where I get into the, okay, how do I want to separate this out based on what I've got? Probably like so. And I still feel like I need more chain link. Let's go with chain link. So one of the things that's inspired me to focus on doing this era and this type of layout too, Railroad Model Craftsman. 2 layouts they featured. One is called Cass County, or Country. I think it's Cass County. And the other one, which is in this month's, or last month's issue, is South Bend Branch, Pennsylvania Railroad. Wonderful era of railroading. Both really great layouts. And I want to give Railroad Model Craftsman a shout out. Forget if I mentioned this last month or not, but they ran an article that I wrote about Great Train Layouts Live and designing layouts in Trainz with a Z. I really appreciate that they understand the benefits of designing layouts with train sims, and I appreciate them featuring me in what we do here. If you've discovered the live streams in the show because of that, please do let me know. And thank you, as always, for tuning. I think I need more. This in particular. Okay. Oh, Alco, Andrew says hi to you, buddy. Rudy Garvey, I think it will be the best guest you've had on the show. I wonder why you might be thinking that. Port Hope, how did I start to like trains? Again, see my father. Grew up with them in terms of going on trips to see them and going to going to model railroad clubs, having a layout in our house. The usual story. Okay, the usual story. Key is always about how you make these your own, and train simulation was the key gateway to how it kind of became my own thing and not just what I did with my dad. Well, before we get to that one, Mean Metal Mike, that would be a great Midwestern Nebraska Kansas grain setting with BNSF or UP. Yeah, I think that could work. And Mr. Railyard, I don't know anything about DNH, but I'm interested to learn. Well, funny you should mention that, because it is time to bring in our guest, our mystery special guest, who is the author of Delaware and Hudson, The Final Years. I'm looking at my copy because I meant to actually have it to hold up and show, but Alco is on my lap right now, so I'll show you guys later. But it is the definitive history of the DNH from 1968 to 1991. I am very happy to bring on to the show, I call him, Ollie. I always find this complicated. Okay. Here we are. Please welcome onto the show, Mr. Rudy Garbely.
Hello, Nick.
Hello, Rudy. You are live. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. So, the reason that you are the super secret mystery surprise guest is because you and I both had COVID, and I didn't want to put you on the spot if you were still recovering from that.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, I am still recovering, but I'm feeling a lot better than I was a couple days ago, so appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad that you're well enough to talk with our audience. So, I'm so glad that you could join us too, because you'll actually be able to at some point talk about the story behind the sharks.
Absolutely.
But I suppose a first place to get started would be, what led you to wanting to research about the DNH?
So I spent a lot of time researching Conrail. That was kind of that was the railroad I grew up with, and kind of what my main interest was. But in researching Conrail, there was always kind of this like little black hole of information off on the side that was the DNH. Always part of the Conrail story, especially post 1976. When the DNH was expanded as a result of competition for Conrail, and there's little to no information available about it. So I kind of started putting together my own bits of information as I researched and I found them. And when the pandemic hit and I was looking for something to do with all my newfound free time, I realized I had a massive folder of information about the DNH that had never been published. And went, well, I know how to write books, and I should probably do one on the DNH now. So kind of started down that path.
Well, and you had that, and then as I understand it, you also, because you'd been researching these other pieces of railroading history, had some interviews that you'd already started with folks who were tangentially involved with the DNH, and so that kind of provided you a springboard of folks to talk to as well, correct?
Yeah, so the first book I ever did was on the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and that was about, 12, 13 years ago now. But whenever I do interviews, I usually record them. So a couple of the guys that worked for the Lehigh Valley went on to work for the DNH, or there were guys that had worked for the DNH that had information that I could use for Lehigh Valley. So I had a couple of interviews that I did over a decade ago that provided me some information that, again, hadn't been published yet and wasn't really usable in the Lehigh Valley book, but it was a springboard for me in terms of having some contacts I could start reaching out to and start kind of getting more people and finding out who they knew and all that kind of stuff. So stuff that I did a decade ago started benefiting me in terms of finding information for my current project.
So was there a particular aha point or some moment where you kind of crossed over to, I'm going to do this, especially because when you look at Al goes off my lap now, so that should be You have to understand, this is a big book. I'm holding it. And here we are now.
Mhm.
So this is a big book. Like, this is just daunting for me to look at, let alone imagining writing it. So did you realize that it was going to be this? Like, when you kind of initially set out to do this?
No, and even in the first drafts of the book, I didn't expect it to be that big. My first draft of the book was only like 40 pages of text, and then plus some photos. And it started growing when I started tracking down all these guys to interview, and every interview I did, it was, I'd end the interview and get 2 more people to talk to from that person. And it started growing exponentially, and the more information I got, the more people would start pointing me in directions of things that they had in their collection that wasn't available to the public, or that I didn't know about, or that wasn't really known about, in terms of a resource to look at, or a person to talk to, or I started talking to people outside the D&H. People that I interviewed for this book included the chairman of the ICC. So it wasn't a all D&H people, but there were people that had something to say about the D&H. And that's what grew the manuscript from like 40 pages initially to, I think it's like 163 pages of text now in just in this book. And that's single space text.
Jeez. And in terms of the kind of reaching out, I mean, there's the reason why I say it's definitive is because of the people that you're talking to in this book. I mean, these are not just middle manager or engineers, although you have that. But you had former presidents, you had former owners. I mean, they like really large stakeholders, and so the ability of one person to lead to another is quite incredible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were people that, honestly, I didn't even realize were still alive, because they retired, from public life or from their railroad careers. There was one guy that I talked to, who'd retired 38 years before I talked to him. He'd been retired for 38 years, longer than I've been alive. And so some of these guys, I just had no concept that they were still around and that they were still available, and a lot of them were thrilled to talk to me because of that. They hadn't talked about this stuff in 40 years, and people forgot that they were there for these things. So it was a really cool experience to be able to talk to a lot of those guys.
What do you think are so well? I suppose a place to start would be what I mean. Obviously, you've got 400 pages, but what are the broad strokes of the story of the D&H from 68 to present for those who might not really know much about it?
Sure. So I kind of picked up the D&H story in 68 deliberately. Jim Shaughnessy wrote what is largely regarded to be the definitive work on the D&H, but he wrote the book in late 67. And it hasn't ever been updated. So, for anybody else reading about the D&H, the history cut off at the end of 67. So I picked up the story right there, and oddly enough, right when Jim cut off writing the book, or when published the book, was a really defining moment in D&H history. His book ends with him acquiring the PAs. That's the last thing that he wrote in the book, and it's almost like an afterword he wrote after he finished writing everything else. So, in a short time span, they acquired the PAs, they upgraded their passenger service. In 1968, the D&H was acquired by the Norfolk and Western through Derico, the same holding company that owned the Erie Lackawanna, which is why if you look at a bunch of photos of the D&H in the late 60s, early 70s, you'll see Erie Lackawanna, N&W, and D&H Power all intermixed. They were all owned by the same company. One of the biggest things was 1972. They got a new president in Bruce Sturzing. Bruce was he's been described to me as a little bit of a rail fan, but he wouldn't describe himself as a rail fan. but he was responsible for bringing in the sharks that we're going to be talking about here in the game momentarily. Doing a lot of railfront excursions. Their big 200th anniversary in 1973 with a lot of his doing. And he was there through the beginning of Conrail and the expansion of the D&H. So Conrail was formed and they needed to find a competitor for it. So the D&H was expanded via trackage rights to compete with Conrail. Ended up being kind of a mess that almost bankrupted the D&H in the late 70s. As a result, D&H was actually acquired by Guilford in 1984 for $500,000, the entire railroad, lock, stock, and barrel. And then obviously, without getting into the politics of Guilford here in this discussion, some things happened with Guilford, and the D&H ended up in bankruptcy in 1988, was operated by the Susquehanna for a couple of years, and then was eventually purchased by CP Rail in 1991. So that's kind of the broad strokes of the Delaware and Hudson. It went from a 744-mile line between Binghamton, New York, and the Canadian border at Rouse's Point. It kind of doubled overnight in 1976, and that was my kind of primary interest going into this book, was that doubling of size and the impacts it had on Northeastern railroading overall. But certainly there's a broader story that needed to be told here, and that's what I ended up digging into.
We often hear the phrase "too big to fail." It seems like the D&H was doubled to fail, as in what I took away from reading was that it was doubled to be a competitor to Conrail, regardless of whether or not that was good for it, and ergo it had been positioned to fail, essentially. Is that too much of an oversimplification?
Not really. So one of the people I talked to was Jim Hagan, who was the president of the USRA, and ultimately his decision to make that happen. The doubling and the trackage rights and all that. And he told me that they kind of just threw something at the wall to see if it would stick, and figured out they would fix it later if they had to. They didn't really have a good plan to support the D&H or make it not fail. They just needed something so they could get Conrail off the ground, and figured they'd revisit the D&H thing later on. And that never happened, which is why it ended up kind of dragging it down and eventually forcing it to be sold to Guilford because it couldn't survive on its own. I think it wasn't designed to fail. It wasn't designed to do anything. It was just kind of an idea, and it never really made it off the table besides being implemented. Like, they never had a plan to implement it. It was just kind of like thrown at them. So.
And Derico is something I see thrown around a lot, and it's something that now I've read enough of that I have a greater grasp of it, but it's admittedly still kind of complex to me. What is Derico?
So Derico was a holding company that was formed by the Norfolk and Western to acquire some other railroads in the Northeast. Specifically, it was a result of the proposed 1964 merger between the N&W and the C&O. And part of that deal was that the ICC told the N&W that if they wanted to merge, they would have to absorb a couple of smaller railroads that would be otherwise negatively impacted by the merger. They would lose a connection, or they'd lose competition, or something like that. They would lose something by the merger, so they had to be incorporated into it. The N&W didn't want to merge them indirectly because a lot of the railroads at that point, even in the late '60s, were a little bit questionable financially. So they wanted to put a layer of protection between the N&W and the smaller railroads. So that's what Derico was formed for. Obviously, the merger never actually happened between the N&W and the C&O. But the N&W still had to fulfill some of its obligations as they were going through the merger proceedings, which lasted up until 71 or so. So in 68, the N&W, like I said, acquired the EL and acquired the D&H. And actually, there was an offer extended to the Boston and Maine as well, and that ended up falling through. But that would have been included as well. So that's all it was a holding company that it was owned by the N&W, or wholly owned by the N&W, and its only two assets were the EL and the D&H. And once the D&H went bankrupt once the EL went bankrupt in 72, they were cast off. And then once the D&H was sold in 84 to Guilford, Derico was dissolved.
Gotcha. Because, yeah, I remember reading in the book you were talking about how the merger of Norfolk and Western and Southern complicated the dissolution of Derico as well.
Yeah, it was still extant, and for a brief period of time, Norfolk Southern from 82 to 84 was actually the D&H's owner via Derico until it was sold to Guilford. So, although kind of beyond the scope of this conversation, N&W and Southern were technically separate entities until 1991, I think, on paper. They transferred some assets to the Southern was the operating entity, and the N&W was the paperwork entity. I don't remember how they made it all work, but anyway, continue.
Finanglings. It's so much of what I've learned about it is finanglings, paper finanglings, or book finanglings. Like it makes sense to someone in some way, in some form. So, Mr. Railyard's asking why CP bought the D&H. There's kind of a number of steps to that. So, I suppose a first place to look is, in a broad sense, why did the D&H as this mega entity fail?
So it was ostensibly providing competition for Conrail, but it was doing so on Conrail's own lines, where it wasn't permitted to originate any traffic. So they couldn't serve a Conrail customer. They could just move traffic over Conrail's lines. And so when you gain 700 miles of track, but you can't do anything other than move over it, it's not particularly helpful. So like, for instance, they got trackage rights from Binghamton to Buffalo, but had 0 customers between Binghamton and Buffalo, which is 400 something miles across New York State. So they were running these trains across New York, but they couldn't get any traffic out of it. All they got was whatever they could get out of Buffalo, from connections to other railroads. So, meanwhile, Conrail had 400 miles of track, and they could run it much more efficiently because they could pick up and set out and have all these branch lines and other connections and everything else along the way. Plus, D&H ended up paying trackage rights fees to Conrail, and there was a running joke that the passing sidings on Conrail were D&H mains because the D&H trains would always get stuck on the siding for a Conrail train to pass them. It was just a very, very inefficient operation, and there was not really a solution that would not have, jeopardized Conrail's success in a time when it was still losing $1 million a day. So nobody was willing to take that step to preserve the D&H at Conrail's expense, and the D&H, didn't have any real position to improve its own situation. So kind of it ended up being a catch-22. And the D&H was caught in the middle of all of it, and really could not succeed given the circumstances it was provided with.
So, given that, Guilford comes in, and Guilford is one of these much maligned, but quite often just not understood entities. I think for me, before I read your book, my understanding was just this sort of generic Guilford equals bad. And hearing stories about like environmental issues but like deteriorating infrastructure, but not really having concrete understanding of it. So what is Guilford's relationship to the D&H, and maybe provide us a bit more nuanced look at what Guilford brought, both good and bad, to that.
Yeah. So, I think, any rail fans familiar with the Northeast or the D&H or, Boston, Maine, or Maine Central, any of the railroads that Guilford owned, kind of developed that same opinion of Guilford equals bad, because the result of Guilford was that these companies that all these people loved and were generally railfan friendly and everything else, kind of lost their independence and lost that kind of hometown friendly feeling. And there were major changes and there were things sold off and blah blah blah, as happens in really any kind of corporate takeover. And I think, I was guilty of going into the book in the same kind of opinion, like, all right, what am I going to find? And, how does that how am I going to frame this so it's not just a disaster unfolding in my book? But I think, getting to go through the conversations with, I spoke to Tim Mellon, who's the owner of Guilford, and several other individuals that were involved. And I think the conclusion that I draw out of that whole thing is that Guilford's biggest problem was messaging and marketing and like their image. They were not good at conveying what they were doing or why, both to the employees and to the rail fans and to the public. That what they did made a lot of sense on paper with what they had. When they bought the D&H in 1984, they bought the D&H for, technically they bought the D&H for $34 million. However, the D&H was $33 million, or $33.5 million in debt at that point. So Guilford paid $500,000 cash for the D&H, for the whole railroad, for 700 something miles of track, 700 miles of trackage rights, all the locomotives, all the property, all the employees, everything, all in one shot, $500,000 in cash. Because they had to absorb the debt, and they had to absorb $33.3 million in debt. That was the problem they were faced with on day one when they walked in the door. And I think that's the part that's often forgotten is the kind of rail fan story is that Guilford came in and bought the D&H for a song and then tried to get as much money out as they could. Well, Guilford was trying to pay off $33 million in debt so that they could start get the ledger back into the black and do anything with the railroad before they had to have some money in the bank before they could do anything with it. And I think that was one of the big eye openers for me. Like, that puts everything else that happened under Guilford, selling off locomotives, selling off spare property, closing shops, laying off employees, downsizing, combining forces with the B&M and doing a lot of run-through trains instead of having independent operations. All the stuff that the rail fans regarded as bad, Guilford was just trying to make the railroad survive. And, there were certainly issues like there are in any kind of corporate takeover where there's a culture problem or there's anything else that goes on. But I think having the perspectives that I got from, both management and from the employees, and having some access to the records that are now 30, 40 years old, I was able to really get a look at the business end of it, in addition to the trains go from A to B end of it, the rail fans all, look at. There's a company there. There's a company that's got to support employees. Company has to be able to support payroll, and they weren't able to do that. So they had to make changes to be able to support payroll. And, I think that's where the conflicts arose between the management of Guilford and the employees at the D&H. That ended up with, there were a bunch of labor strikes in the mid-'80s, and a bunch of proposed changes to the labor agreements, and eventually the railroad ended up in bankruptcy because they couldn't get the Guilford could not get concessions from labor enough that would reduce the costs down to something that the railroad could sustain. So, and whether that's the fault of the management or that's the fault of labor for not negotiating, either way, I left that up to the reader in my book. I didn't try to pass judgment on that, but I think that's an important part of that story is that there are two sides to that, and we only ever hear one of them. So
it's good to be able to put aside our biases in these cases, because so often we hear things parroted as to just accept them as gospel and really look deep and try as best we can to understand a really complex situation. I mean, complex, like that. The phrase that I kept playing over and over in my mind as I'm reading this, and you do such a great job of simplifying it as much as possible so that I can actually follow it, and to an extent where it's relatable and not dry, but it is still quite complex over and over in terms of these relationships, these evolving companies and holding companies and so forth. The glossary comes in handy on more than one occasion. So
yeah, the glossary I actually made for myself while writing the book, because I was reading all these, government reports and stuff, and I needed a reference for myself, so I didn't get lost while I was trying to figure it all out myself. So the glossary pre-existed the publication.
Interesting. Makes perfect sense, though. Guilford, so pathway to from Guilford to CP, what does that look like?
So when DNH was put into bankruptcy, the operations were taken over temporarily by the New York Susquehanna and Western under what was called a directed service order from the government, from the FRA. Basically to continue keep the railroad running, but eventually knowing that there's going to have to be a resolution to the fact that it is bankrupt. So it basically buys them time, keeps an essential service operating, and buys everybody time to figure out what to do about it. So it was known from day one in June of '88 when the railroad went bankrupt that it was going to have to eventually have a buyer, or somehow either climb out of bankruptcy on its own or be purchased by somebody that was not bankrupt, that could continue to operate it in some kind of profitable manner. So there were a couple different parties that expressed interest in that, and CP was one of them. And CP was at the time looking for expansion opportunities into kind of a New York market, a New York and Eastern U.S. market, and it was kind of a logical conclusion for them to go after the DNH because the connection already existed in Montreal. With the DNH's subsidiary of the Naperville Junction. So they had a direct connection, and they could use both the DNH's proper and the DNH's trackage rights that they'd obtained over Conrail to serve markets. And the CP felt that with the overhead traffic that they could generate, it would be profitable for them to do things like Buffalo or Oak Island outside of Newark, New Jersey, and other locations that for the DNH they couldn't generate enough traffic on their own to do that. So I actually, part of my book process, I actually had the opportunity to talk to Rob Ritchie, who was the president of CP Rail when they made the acquisition, and Doug Welsh, who was one of the planners at CP Rail, who was kind of charged with implementing the takeover when that finally occurred. So that was kind of a logical thing for CP at the time, and both of them kind of said it didn't exactly work out the way that we thought they was going to. There wasn't exactly as much traffic there as they thought they would find, and it didn't integrate as well into the CP system as they thought it would, which I think is probably why the southern half of the DNH was sold to NS in 2014. But at the time it seemed like it made sense, and that's kind of how it came to fruition. So.
Time for a listener question. Let's see, where was it? Mean Metal Mike. Did the DNH have any passengers? If so, any named trains?
Yeah. So pre-Amtrak, this is pre-May of '71. The DNH's big train was the Laurentian. Which was what they had actually acquired the PAs for in 1967. And they acquired a whole bunch of Rio Grande coaches at the same time to kind of modernize their operations. the PAs actually replaced. They were using steam generator equipped RS3s up until the late '60s. So the PAs were the first streamlined locomotives on the D&H, and they were the ones that they used to pull the Laurentian. They also had an overnight train. The Laurentian was a daytime train. That was a New York to Montreal train. It was jointly operated by the D&H and the New York Central, and later Penn Central, with a change in Albany. And that was the daytime train with the Laurentian. They also had an overnight train that was the Montreal Limited that ran the same route, just overnight, with sleeping cars. The Montreal Limited and the Laurentian were both discontinued at the time of Amtrak in May of '71, because Amtrak already had the Montrealer that ran via Vermont. They felt they did not need a second route to Montreal. And then it was actually so that the PAs were actually two of them were leased out to a company called Steam Tours, and they ran some excursions around Hagerstown, Maryland for a while. And the other two PAs were actually traded into GE as credit towards a future locomotive order that never happened. And after Bruce Sterling became president in '72, he recalled all four of them, including the two that had been traded into GE. And that's why they used them for the 200th anniversary excursions in '73. In 1974, Amtrak wanted to reopen the route over the D&H to Montreal due to popular demand for it. Except Amtrak, by '74, was struggling to find equipment to operate the route. And D&H said, well, we have these PAs here that we could run it with. And they ended up so Amtrak ended up contracting the operation of the Adirondack to the D&H from 1974 to 1977, when the PAs were finally taken off and replaced by Amtrak turboliners. So that was the end of D&H passenger service per se. Would be at '77, even though after '74 it was contracted by Amtrak. It was still operated by the D&H up until '77.
All right, the question that everybody's been getting to, and I'll bring out I'll bring them out just so that it's fitting for the occasion, which is why the shark noses? So also from Mean Metal Mike, why did the two shark noses? He says escaped the Escanaba Lake Superior Railroad, although they're still there. So I guess more specifically, how did these guys escape scrap to go to the D&H? To then become legendary and then eventually make their way to the ENLS.
So, as much as everybody would like it to be a, great story of preservation and, foresight and planning, and somebody had their, their eyes out on these special locomotives, that really wasn't the case. The answer is that they were cheap. So by 1974, the D&H was struggling to find reliable and usable motive power. They hadn't bought a new locomotive in a number of years, and didn't have any money left, and we're kind of. And this is the situation that they went into Conrail with, so it only got worse from there. But this is '74, and they got a call one day from the David Joseph Company, I think it was, in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was a used equipment dealer. They did like used railroad equipment and scrap and all that kind of stuff. And one of the guys there knew Bruce Sterling at the D&H and said, hey, I know you guys are looking for motive power. We got this pair of Baldwin Shark-nose diesels out here for the Monongahela. We don't really have to do with them, and they're operating. We don't really want to scrap them, but we don't have nobody wants them because they're Baldwins. And they offered him the D&H scrap value. And D&H turned around and offered him an equivalent number of scrap freight cars. So what ended up happening was a trade. So D&H traded them $12,000 worth of scrap freight cars. It was like 50 or so gondolas and boxcars. And in return, they got a pair of Baldwin Sharks. So for, $6,000 a locomotive, roughly, in scrap, they got two locomotives, but they didn't have to spend any cash on them, which is the perfect thing for a railroad that's broke. And they got them back to colony shops up near Albany, and they were they had when they knew they were getting them, they contacted actually a local model railroader named Jay Wynn, and had him pick up a couple model power HO scale sharks and kind of redesign a paint scheme onto them. And he gave him a couple different options. One of them was like a New York Central lightning stripe design that kind of original to the sharks, but with the D&H colors. And then he gave him a couple different adaptations of the D&H's version of the Santa Fe war bonnet that they used in the PAs. And that's ultimately what they went with. So they painted them up and they used them. They didn't MU with anything else in the D&H roster. They basically were only used by themselves. They used to be used as helpers out of Binghamton. Going up over the hill because they were good helpers. You could, push anything with a Baldwin. And again, they were running by themselves. They used them on the Sayre turn, which was the D&H's interchange train with the Lehigh Valley. And eventually, towards the end of their careers, they were retired in '77, so they only made it about 3 years in the D&H. But towards the end of their careers, they made their way up onto the Slate Picker local, which was the D&H local that ran into Vermont. So,
it gets me that the design process was go get an HO scale model, and we'll figure out how to make it look right.
Yeah, yep. And they painted. Like I said, I think Jay painted up 3 or 4 different options for him and brought him into the office and said, "What do you guys think?" And they were like, "Let's go with that one." That's how they came up with the design. So
the truth is stranger than fiction. So see, what we do in model railroading has potentially real world impacts. I love that. And let's see. Here's a good question. Just general knowledge question. Dean asks, I'm curious as to how one acquires the resources to have such a vivid understanding as you do.
So I do this professionally, in that I don't have another job, which is helpful because a lot of this is just time. A lot of this is just, spend a lot of time in the internet finding people or call people and see if they got a phone number or an email contact or something. But yeah, so much of this is oral knowledge. It's things that people told me or I talked to somebody. I mean, the thing about getting the sharks came from Bruce Sturzing. I wouldn't have had that story if I hadn't talked to him directly. Bruce was the president of the D&H at the time. He's the one that made the decision to bring the sharks in. So, nobody more qualified to tell me that what happened than the guy that made it happen. I have the advantage of doing this full time and that I can, devote the time to it that it needs. But I mean, the writing the book took me about 2.5 years. And that wasn't continuous effort. It wasn't like I just sat here for 8 hours a day and wrote a book. I run my own company and I did other projects in the meantime for other authors and even did one of my own books in the meantime. But whenever I had free time, I was making phone calls or sending emails or writing something or reading a book or finding a book or whatever it was, to get more information or, looking through the Library of Congress for congressional testimony or trying to read through 500-page documents from the USRA about studies of the D&H at the beginning of Conrail, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's how you acquire this much knowledge, is just spend the time on it. You have to want the knowledge enough to devote the amount of time to it that it takes to not only gather the knowledge, but be able to talk about it, kind of freely as I do. And even then, I will confess that I'm not remembering all of the stuff off the top of my head. I have the book open here in front of me because I wanted to make sure I got some of the details about the acquisition of the sharks correct. Because the book came out over a year ago. So, I've moved on to other projects. But I remember enough of it to know where in the book I have to look for it. And that's part of it too. Is just I can remember what book I saw something in to go back and find it again or find more details on it or remember who talked to me about something so I can go back and give them another phone call or whatever it is. But I mean, just this book alone, I had something like 60 or 70 hours of recorded interviews to weed through, on top of all the paper research that I did. So there's a ton of knowledge that I'm sure I have. There's some stuff that's not even in the book that I'm sure I know. But that's also from 2.5 years of effort to learn it all. So I consider myself fortunate to have the time and resources to do that.
And patience, because original research is hard. Research as a term gets thrown around so frequently, but true original research where you're recording interviews with the people who were there, tracking down those people, being able to coordinate times, conducting those multiple interviews. That's one piece of it. And then you mentioned congressional testimonies. I think that for a lot of rail fans, or people in general, we want the exciting stuff. We want let's look through photo archives and find the fun photos. But the sort of, let's go through really dry legal records to find what we need to find the original thing, is A, not the first thing we think of, B, not the most exciting thing that we can think of in the process.
No, understood. And I mean, it all just serves to give a broader understanding of what happened. Like how do we get to the point that the D&H has now acquired all of the Alco C420s from the Lehigh Valley Railroad? Well, there's a weird story to that. So let's go to the congressional stuff or the USRA stuff and figure out how the hell that happened. Because, somewhere buried in that paperwork, there was a decision made that affected that made that possible or made that a thing. And so I tried when writing the book, like the book doesn't sit here and quote congressional testimony because I wouldn't read my own book if that's what it did. But I do use that to frame out like, hey, the USRA decided this, so here's what happened. And so I think it's important to have that framework when you're doing some kind of research to be able to put it in a larger perspective of why the decisions were made, and not just that something happened. Because if you're just recording, at that point you're just recording observations. Yes, the D&H acquired a bunch of C420s, but why? Anyone that was standing trackside in 1977 could have seen that. But recording the history of it is understanding why that happened. I think that's where I dig into the next level of things beyond maybe what the average person would have time to or the resources to.
And just to emphasize, this is not, and this is my opinion, but having read enough railroad histories, this is not a dry read. This is not a dry book. This is it is big. It is big, hefty, weighty. But look, tons of photos. So you have plenty of photos to get you through. And you can if anybody's like, well, it's kind of a heavy book to travel with, I took this book to the top of Mount Washington and read it there for a number of hours. So I welcome other people's excuses for not traveling with it.
Did you get a bumper sticker for it?
I did get a bumper sticker for it, although it doesn't seem to be here in the moment. I found a photo of a shark too. There's a bunch of pages on. Well, you had like 3 pages on the shark, but there's the one that I turned to immediately.
86.
Yeah. So yes, you can travel and read this book. I was actually it was with Christine and Green, and we were filming Steam Locos in Profile, his Mount Washington Cog Railway special, which meant that we had to wait for the 2 steam trains per day at the top of the hill. So you see the one, and then it goes down at 4 miles an hour, whatever the speed is. It crawls down, then it crawls back up. So it was the slowest train watching day for Steve that I've probably ever experienced. So yes, your book was a great way of being able to kill the time between those two visits of their steam locomotive at the top of Mount Washington.
Yeah. If there are a couple more user questions. Well, I guess to answer me, Metal Mike's question about the Escanaba and Lake Superior, the D&H retired the Sharks in 77, and in 78 they were sold to Castor-Light Corporation in Michigan, which ran them for a couple of years. Now the 1205, I think it was. One of the two, I think it was 1205, always had a cracked block. It had a cracked block when the D&H got it, and they just kept welding it. Every time it would crack again, they'd put another weld bead over it, and that was it. So eventually that one, eventually one of the two of them had a mechanical failure in Michigan. I don't remember if it was before or after they were sold to Escanaba and Lake Superior. And then the other one they were running by itself in the snow, and they ran it backwards, and there was no plow on the back of it, obviously, and they ran it into a snowbank and shorted out the traction motor. So that took the second one out of service. So they are still up there in Wells, Michigan, on the Escanaba and Lake Superior. They are owned by John Larkin, who is the owner. And supposedly he has plans for them to go to a museum upon his death. But after some railfan incidents with them in the late 80s, the builder's plates were stolen off of them by railfans. The horns were stolen off of them by railfans. Some other pieces were stolen. They got locked away, kind of out of sight. As a matter of fact, for a while, he made reproduction builder's plates, put them on there. The reproduction builder's plates got stolen, and then he said, finally, that's enough, and kind of squirreled them away where no one could see them. One of them did make an appearance about a year and a half ago. They were moved out of the shop, so the shop could get worked on. But so they are still up there, but they have not really been outside much in the last 35 years or so. But they are the only two surviving Sharks left. And whether they run again or not is going to be up to where they end up after Mr. Larkin gets rid of them. So
certainly an interesting fate. It was for so long that, like, do we even know if they still exist, because they hadn't seen the light of day for such a long time. Let's see. I can answer this one. So what was the station the D&H used going into Montreal? That would be Windsor Station. Which was a CP station and still exists, but not has no rails anymore. Mr. Railyard, is there any D&H steam locomotives preserved? I can also answer this one. No, sadly. But
well, technically.
Well, okay, you can work your technical.
How technically do you want to get here, Nick?
You take it where you want, but on the tin value of is there a locomotive that was used in the D&H common carrier era during its during the prime of steam in the teens to 50s? No.
There is a tender remaining.
Yes.
There is a D&H Northern tender that I believe is still up on CP as a water car.
Challenger, but close.
Challenger tender. Okay, whatever. And then it depends on if you count the boiler and single piston from the Sturbridge Lion as a steam locomotive.
Right, that's the one I was thinking of.
But ironically, the first and last steam locomotives of the D&H, the only pieces left are the boiler and piston from the very first steam locomotive, and a tender from one of the very last ones.
Yes.
Nothing in between.
Yeah, it's quite the irony. And the story that I've heard on the Challenger tender, it had been converted by CP for somebody. They actually, would have been the D&H originally for as like a firefighting tender,
yes.
like for water storage. And the story that I've heard from folks involved with CP who are part of that Facebook group for the 2816 say they were taking 2816 from Scranton to Canada on the D&H. They went through Binghamton or Oneonta, and wherever that tender was stored, saw it and went, "We need that." And so Mr. Ritchie makes some phone calls, and that gets set aside too.
Mm-hmm. I believe it was Oneonta that it was stored at.
Yeah.
They used to use it for remote firefighting because there's, either direction on Oneonta, there's nothing. So there's a whole bunch of open wilderness. So I think that's where it was, Oneonta, if I remember correctly. But
sounds right to me. So we're coming up on playtime here, and I want to make sure that my layout passes the muster as at least pseudo D&H. So Rudy, if you're looking at the stream now, or even if you're not, what's a little detail or something that I can put in here that's gonna sell? Okay, this is D&H in the 70s that I might not already have. My lines might look a little too nice. I will admit that, but that's the challenge with simulation.
I was gonna say you need derail the freight car parts somewhere. That would make it more accurate.
I do have a scrapyard with some stuff, but no freight.
Yeah, just like a set of wheel sets or something off in the ditch somewhere. No, I mean honestly, the D&H in the 70s was a pretty generic railroad. It with everything they bought, everything they owned was very base level. They didn't have anything unique. They didn't have any it wasn't like the Southern Pacific where the locomotives had a crazy light package on them, or every beacon on the roof or every antenna on the roof. Like everything they bought was just the lowest base level they could get. Your crossbucks were usually just wood slapped on a pole. Nothing special. So yeah, I mean, if your railroad looks generic, it's probably right for the D&H of the 70s. It honestly is, honestly about right.
Good to know. I'll take it then. And honestly, because I like with some of these builds, they end up being very, very specific. Like this is obviously going to be the UK, or this is obviously going to be modern or old school. But I like generic, because I feel like then that way people can kind of play with what they want on it. Because as I mentioned at the top of the show, this was designed by Rob Chant, and it was marketed as a New York Central branch. I mean, heck, you could run New York Central Sharks. But so I just felt like taking it in D&H direction. But I like the idea that people are going to bring different eras or different equipment to the mix.
Yeah.
So excellent. So now we get to have some fun, and we get to stage some cars. And you get to laugh at me in person, because I know you're usually reserving your laughter on the sidelines for when I make my questionable switching choices, is how I'd like to put that. That's the phrase I'm going with. Questionable switching choices. But now you get to be here in person.
Metal Mike, yeah, D&H connected to both the Erie and the Lackawanna, in Binghamton specifically, but at a couple of locations as well. Matter of fact, the entire D&H main between Nineveh and Scranton, not quite Scranton, but was actually originally an Erie branch line of the Erie Jefferson branch. That was first D&H got trackage rights on it, and then leased it, and then just bought it outright. So yes, there were several connections with the Erie and Lackawanna in the Scranton and northeastern Pennsylvania area, and Binghamton and lower New York as well.
The other risk of having somebody who knows what they're talking about on here is that I'm putting too modern equipment. But 50-foot's were a thing in the 70s, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just check.
The 50-foot PS2 boxcar was introduced in 1950. 2, 1. So, and the design you've got there is, I mean, could be any boxcar, generically after the mid '60s, with the roof walk removed.
Works for me. I'll take it then. Speaking of D&H Steam, though, we should give you a chance to sell your wares. So the book that we've been talking about, the final years, do you have any copies of that left on your store?
I do not. So I ran 1,000 copies of it, and they sold out. Pretty surprisingly to me, actually. Didn't realize there was that much interest in the D&H. So what I've done is I have made it available as a print-on-demand reprint. If you go to DelawareHudson.org, you can order your own copy of it. They are expensive, but it's also 416 pages, so,
And 416 pages that are totally worth it. Again, you get tons of photos, really rare and contextual things. Like there was a one-off paint scheme, an experimental paint scheme, and so you have photos of the one engine in the experimental paint scheme, and you also have interviews with the guy about who famously developed that in paint scheme.
Mm-hmm.
So
and didn't like it afterwards.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that, Pacific Productions. What's my thoughts on Trainz Surveyor 2.0? Also, you saw my latest parody, Rarer Than the Sticks, it was called. Well, thank you. Yes, my East Broad Top Song parody. That was a fun one to create. I had a lot of fun with that. And Surveyor 2.0 is complicated. That's my thoughts. It's complicated. I could probably learn it, but it is so different. Nothing is where I expect it to be. So that's the short review of that. Briefly back to your book. So good to know that people could order it on demand. And you should definitely consider doing that if you've been listening to it and going, oh, I want to learn more. Secondarily, you are putting together, publishing a new book on D&H Steam.
Yeah, I actually literally took a break from doing the layout on that so I could hop on here tonight. So, so I'm working with Chris Shepard as the author, who's the president of the Bridgeline Historical Society, or vice president, I'm sorry, of the Bridgeline Historical Society, and he's doing basically the comprehensive book on D&H Steam, covering everything from the ordering of the Sturbridge Line in 1828 to the end of D&H Steam operations in 1953. So it'll be a class-by-class book. It's going to be over 500 pages, I think, at this point. I don't know exactly yet because I haven't finished laying it out. But full rosters, mechanical data, photos, diagrams, all kinds of stuff. So I'm pretty excited about this one because it's something that hasn't ever really been covered, in significant detail as a resource for other researchers or modelers or anything like that. So
that is one that excites me. I'm one of the various Discord servers I belong to. There's a long-running fight as to whether Delaware and Hudson steam locomotives are attractive. I am here to definitively say they are.
So, as a D&H fan, there are ones that were attractive. And then there are the Challengers, the Northerns, and the Pacifics that had that weird recessed headlight that I just hate.
Not weird. Awesome. European, classy headlight.
I just don't like it.
Oh, for shame, Mr. Garbling. Though that is the attraction of it. Look, any old body could have like UP Challengers, fine, whatever. The D&H Challenger was where it was at. That is a look. That is a look that I will stand by, as long as I need to. I will do.
Listen, I'm a D&H fan, but I'm an American first. we don't put our headlights recessed into the smoke box. I'm sorry.
And you talked about this too. the with the
Yeah.
2102 when it
Mhm.
was masquerading as D&H 302. How they came up with the recessed headlight for that one.
Yep, that's in the book. I'll leave that one as a story for people that read the book. But there's a whole story in there about how they modified the 2102 to put the recessed headlight on it.
Yep, yeah, that one's a good. That's a good story
Hmm.
there. Let's see. I think I'm gonna feel like I might have filled my sidings too much, but I'll figure out what I want to actually switch when I get there. We'll leave that empty just so that I'm not going. Oh, nah, I should. I just have a little bit of local.
Mr. Railyard said, "What's the story with D&H in Canada?" So, the D&H owned a subsidiary in Canada called the Naperville Junction Railroad that ran from the New York border at Rouse's Point up to a connection, actually to a set of connections with both CN and CP just south of Montreal. It was basically operated as a separate company just for on paper, so they had a Canadian company in Canada and a U.S. company in the U.S. And then the D&H obviously used the Naperville Junction and trackage rights on CP to run the Laurentian and the Montreal Limited, and then later the Adirondack into Windsor Station in Montreal proper. Not much more of a story than that. They operated in Canada just enough to get from the border into Montreal. There wasn't much there in terms of customer base or anything. It was just a way to interchange into Canada and become and kind of justify the D&H's nickname as the bridge line, because they were able to bridge traffic into Canada a lot more effectively than a lot of other routes were. So
there you go. Yeah, if you have any other questions for Rudy, throw them in here while we're at it. Okay, I've got enough cars situated here, so we're going to take one last guy before we get up running. I'm happy with that. I'm going to go cabooseless because I don't have a D&H caboose handy. One last thing to worry about operationally. So something that one would consider if you had more room, you've got one runaround on this tire layout, and that's over here. So in a way, unless you stage your train with a caboose, good off here, because this is actually, that's right, that's supposed to be an interchange. Yeah, well, we'll stage with the caboose. Why not? Because you only have the one runaround. It's a big runaround, so you've got more than enough room to do whatever you need. But it is only one. I'm this car here and everything else I need. Like so. But yeah, so perhaps you can tell folks too, a little bit more about some of. We've talked a lot about D&H, but maybe tell folks about some of your other book offerings, both those that you've authored as well as those by other people.
sure. I'm actually going to say real quick, it would be very difficult for you to find a correct model of a D&H caboose, since almost every one of them were unique. My D&H caboose, my D&H caboose book would have been offended if you, tried to pose with a different caboose. So
I'm not going to pretend it's. I'm just going to go with something that is of a different road, so that then it's being borrowed, like B&M or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah, B&M, MW, EL, whatever, all appropriate for the era. So, yeah, I mean, I've done books on all kinds of stuff. Conrail, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the New York Susquehanna and Western. I just did a book on. Literally came out last month on the Susquehanna. Blanking on what I've done here. My first book was in the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And then obviously I've done books for authors on all kinds of subjects. We had a book on the Milwaukee Road in the 30s. We did a book on the Burlington route in the 30s. We just did our first volume of books on the Buffalo Creek Railroad up in Buffalo. We've done stuff on business trains. We've done stuff on all kinds of different railroad subjects. We did a couple of books on the East Broad Top. We've done books on U.S. railroad operations during World War One. So really, I mean, any kind of railroad history subject that as long as it's something that I think I can sell, and again, this is my full-time job, so it's not going to be something that I can pay my mortgage with. But as long as it's something that I can sell, we'll see if we can get it out there and provide more information to people so that in 50 years when somebody else is looking for a book to read and trying to find information on their subject, like I've been doing on certain things, I can find that person can find the information they're looking for. So. Mr. Railyard, the DNH used whatever horns and whistles they could get a hold. Whistles they had, basically each kind of engineer had their own preference, like a lot of smaller railroads. But horns the DNH used whatever the hell they could get, or whatever the engine came with. In a lot of cases, they had no real horn preference or standard. So.
All right. Speaking of which. So the Baldwins had, I'm guessing these were Leslie A200s because they were single chime horns.
200s and 125s. I don't remember which ones. I'm sure I can find somebody that knows, but I don't know off the top of my head.
So coming into our scene, we have our interchange with the Lehigh Valley here. So what we're going to do is we're going to lift this car, which is going to be going into town, and then swapping these green cars out where they are. Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me when I first saw the variety of offerings that you have are the tugboat books that Paul's authored.
Mm-hmm.
It's just I always love my eclectic pieces of railroad history that are railroad but aren't railroad, and that really is something that is the epitome of railroad but not railroad.
Yeah, we joked that tugboats are the locomotives of the sea. But I've been working with Paul on that. I mean, the first one came out last year, but I've been working with Paul on that with the first of a series of books, and it's been like 6 or 7 years. Paul is uniquely qualified to write that book, in that he is a full-time railroader and a former tugboat crewman on the Lehigh Valley Railroad Cornell. So probably the only person that's qualified in that way to write a book on railroad tugboats. So that's something I know nothing about going into it. A lot of these other books that we do, I'm fortunate in that I have some semblance of the history, and I can proofread, or I can, interject, or I can add some thoughts to it or something. But these, I literally was like, Paul, I'm trusting you're correct. I have no idea. And but like, I had nothing to add. I had nothing to offer him in terms of input or knowledge or connections or anything. It was just like, all right, well, I'm assuming that this is everything there is to know about this, because there isn't anything else out there. Just nothing else covering that at all. It's a neat subject. So.
Mm-hmm. And neat and niche because it's so specific to the Northeast. There might be other examples elsewhere in the country, but when I think of tugboats, I think of New York and Chesapeake, and that's kind of the extent of my knowledge. My very knowledge.
So there's at least one more volume coming. We're trying to determine if it's enough to do 2 volumes, 2 smaller volumes, or 1 large one. That will be the Great Lakes and the West Coast. Santa Fe actually had a massive fleet of tugboats that operated around San Francisco. And then there were a couple railroads that had tugboats. I mean, obviously there were the car ferries and other stuff up in the Great Lakes, but there were some railroad tugboats in the Great Lakes as well. So.
then you mention train sets and like special trains, and I think of the Conrail office car special book, which is sitting on my shelf, forlornly waiting for its turn to be read.
Yeah, we did a whole book, 400 and something pages on Conrail's office car special, and both its operations and each individual piece of equipment. I have exactly one copy of that book left in stock, by the way. One lone copy sitting out there on the shelf. Even things that are, that specific or that unique or that niche within a niche, you have to like Conrail and then also like passenger trains and also like that passenger train to buy that book. We've done stuff like that too, and as long as people keep buying it, we'll keep doing them. So.
I gotta get myself out of the trees here. Yeah, I think that it's so great to see you being able to continue to focus on this as your full-time job and offer such a wide range of books, because as much as there are all these other competing forms of media, there's just nothing like a book. There's nothing like holding a book, looking at the photos in a book, even if I can read something on the e-reader, especially with a rare history. I want a book. I want it to be held.
Yeah, and there's something to be said too for. I prefer to ingest my history through a non-digital means, and I think maybe that's, I don't know, the most boomer thing I've ever said. But like, I don't know. It just feels like if I'm gonna try to take something in that's talking about something that happened, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, it's something that by default happened in a non-digital era. So it just seems more appropriate to me to be kind of, or more immersive, I guess, to me, to be doing that in a non-digital means. And honestly, I think my readers really agree with that too. We did offer e-copies for our first couple of books we did. And I think I sold 3 total.
Wow.
3 total e-copies of any title combined. So we stopped offering them because I don't think there's the demand for e-copies of history that people want to have some kind of physical connection to. It's an interesting concept, and it's one that I've debated a couple times because I keep hearing that the end is nigh, and we need to all convert to digital means. But I opened a print history company 11 years ago, and I think I'm doing okay. I mean, if anyone had told me 11 years ago that I was going to be doing it for a living, I would have laughed at them. So, I've been very fortunate there, but I think, the demand for it exists, and as long as the demand for it exists, I'm going to keep doing it.
I think the demand's going to be there for a while, especially because, and we were talking about this recently, how there's this now. The folks who remember the 60s and 70s of railroading, there's a number still around, and a number who can recall it and give details, but only for so long. And then that's going to be true of the 80s and 90s, and there's so much to be gleaned from that era that needs to be turned into books, that needs to be preserved in a digestible format so people can understand how some of these short lines came to be and so forth. That is really crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I was super fortunate. I did, the DNH book we've been talking about came out in August of last year. And 4 of the gentlemen that I interviewed for the book have passed away already. And all the interviews were done between 2020 and 2022. So these are all recent interviews, but also recent deaths, and I was very fortunate to get to some of them when I did, just before they passed, because those memories go away too, and the things that make the study of that history or the interpretation of the history or the human part of that history possible kind of go away with them. So, that's why I've always kind of tended to focus on not so distant past. I've done we've done some titles that are older that are World War One era, early American Railroad history stuff, but I tend to focus on stuff that's 60s, 70s, now getting into the 80s stuff, because that's the era where everybody's still with us, but aren't going to be for a whole lot longer. So you can talk to people that are, that were instrumental in the industry 40 years ago. But, that opportunity might not be there in 10 years. So I'm trying to take that opportunity now while I've got access to those people, to be able to write down those stories and get them on paper before they're gone.
It's a collaborative effort and recognizing where we have all these resources and crossing over. You with the publishing, me with the podcast, the various other outlets that people have as far as networking events and just getting to know, because that's so much of it is who you know, and somebody telling you to talk to somebody, telling you should. It's so much of it is through verbal communication.
Well, and that's how I ended up with this book. I mean, really was I knew a couple of people, and they said you should call these people too, and then I called those people too, and they said you should call somebody else, and I go from. I mean, the people I started with here were like, I talked to Fred Cheney, who was the D&H's CMO, and by the time I get to the end of the thing, I'm talking to the head of the ICC, and I'm talking to the president of the USRA, and I've talked to, two D&H presidents and CP Rail president, and like the Guilford's president and owner, and all these people that were leaders in the railroad industry for decades. And it's because I knew somebody somewhere that they'd crossed paths with, and like it was able to chain together enough people to get to the people that were on top. And that only happened through the connections that I made, and not through. I wasn't just Googling people and hoping for the best. Like, you had to know somebody, or you had to have somebody vouch for you and say, yeah, this guy's doing something for real here. You should talk to him. So.
Random question that just popped into my head, and I don't know that it really has any immediate bearing in our field, but just because everybody's talking about it, what are your thoughts on AI and AI's role in just writing in general?
So, my perspective on this may be a little bit surprising. I've actually used it not for my own books. Like I'm not writing books with AI. But I've used it in the nonprofit sphere. I've used AI text for proposals, for grant writing, for things like that, where, I know what I want it to say, but I want to make sure I hit the keywords, especially in grant writing or things like that, where, it's so important to have certain keywords or buzzwords on the paper that they're going to be, that the grant administrators are going to be looking for. What I'll do is I'll write a draft or something of, here's the project, here's what we're doing, here's the, what we're asking for money-wise, whatever it is, and then I'll put it through an AI engine and say, like, okay, make this a grant proposal using, grant writing language or something. And I found some pretty good results. And there's a few that I've made it out, off of my desk with basically what the AI put almost intact. You got to check it over for every once in a while. I have a weird grammatical error or something strange. It's very non-human. But generally, I think it's useful if you use it as a tool. I don't think you're ever going to replace the kind of human emotion that goes into writing. Even as a history person, you're writing a story. Like I could write you a really boring story about the D&H, or I could write you a really exciting story about the D&H. It's all about how a human's going to frame that out. And how a human's going to do the research, and how a human's going to extrapolate the stories and pick from the stories to decide which ones to publish and decide what track that story is going to follow. So I don't think it's necessarily going to replace humans, but it's certainly something that can be used as a writing tool, just like, your little squiggly lines in Microsoft Word will tell you that you've written something incorrectly, or did you mean to say this? Or, you have tools like Grammarly that's sort of an AI writing tool now. They're all great, helpful tools for somebody that understands how to write on their own and can then take the input from an AI or other tool and use it to make even better writing out of it.
Very thoughtful, as I would expect from you. Oh, good.
Yeah, but I've used it, and it does work. I mean, in certain cases, but it has to be certain cases, and it has to be with human oversight. You can't just let it loose on its own, because it ends up not being right. So.
Right. Especially with railroad history. It'll write something that sounds intelligent, but is not, in fact.
Right.
Interesting. Millennial Modeler, I've adjusted the levels a bit, so hopefully we're a little bit closer to equal at this point.
You just got a lot louder for me, Nick, so.
Okay, good. Hopefully, yeah. Folks will let me know if I overcorrected on that particular part. The challenges of being a one-man band in these regards.
Mm-hmm.
To control audio levels, switch with Baldwin charts, and be able to hold conversation. The real triple threat. I will say though that this is a nice. I've built some real humdingers of puzzles that I've been like, oh, this is really hard to switch. This is not so bad because you just have this gigantic runaround. They're still kind of thinking ahead of what do I want to do, but broad strokes, like everything here is facing the same way. So I don't need to be thinking, okay, I need my engine on this side. It's like, no, actually, everything came in facing the right way, so I'm just going to make all my pickups and then take those cars and put them into what tracks they need. So this is not as hard as I thought it might be. So yay for being able to split my brain. So I don't know how much you want to talk about your upcoming projects, things that you're embarking on research now or not, but whatever you feel free to release knowledge-wise to the world, see fit to do so.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about having connections and where that kind of leads in the railroad industry and stuff. Several of the people that I work with on the D&H book went on to work for Iowa Interstate. And so I've been slowly working on an Iowa Interstate book. Next year is that railroad's 40th anniversary. So I was just mentioning working on stuff, from the 80s and even newer. I'm fortunate that every officer of the Iowa Interstate that they've ever had in the company's history is still living, including the founder, Dr. Paul Banner, who is 102. It's kind of a fortuitous that I have the opportunity to do that now while I've got access to everybody, and I can write a really comprehensive book on the railroad's entire history in the first 40 years, with access to every person that was involved with it. So it's kind of that's a neat project I'm working on now. And obviously there's more coming from other authors as well. We're doing a book on the CNJ, first of a series of books on the CNJ in the 70s. Some of these are more photo books. Some of them are going to be more research books. We're doing a pretty comprehensive book on the Springfield Terminal Railroad. I'm trying to think through what I've got on my
Ooh, the Springfield Terminal. My ears perked up because that's interurban.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The Springfield Terminal Railway, Vermont's last interurban. It's the name of the book.
Gotcha. So that's covering everything from the interurban era to its Guilford era.
Yes. Actually,
Nice.
I think it covers basically up to the Guilford era, because the Springfield terminal basically ceased to exist. Uh, the original Springfield terminal era ceased to exist as an operating entity basically once Guilford took it over. We are doing volume 2 of our Buffalo Creek Railroad series. This obviously the DNA steam locomotive book. There will be eventually a volume 4 in our Susquehanna series coming sometime next year. Um, and we're going to be doing a book on Ellen and Big Emma steam locomotives.
Wow.
That's been announced. It doesn't have a release date yet, but it will be sometime in mid 2024. So, yeah, all of the map, all kinds of stuff. Even some stuff from further west that we're looking at that I don't have anything firm on yet, so I can't really talk about it. But there's hopefully some West Coast stuff coming next year too. So,
What advice would you give to somebody looking to get into looking to write a history? Because it seems so daunting from my standpoint. The idea of research and meeting people and figuring out the scope of whatever it is you're going to cover and how in depth to go and how to develop the right authorial tone. I mean, these feel like really intimidating uh, hurdles to cross. So how does one kind of go about starting one's journey into railroad research and authorship?
read, pick up other railroad history books, and get a sense for what's out there. Get a sense for how people write about railroads. Get a sense for how people talk about railroads. Because if there's a book out there, you know, it has been sold. Somebody has bought that book, and therefore there's some level of interest in that book. And there's certain books that are more well known than others, and there's reasons for that. But pick up a Jim Shaughnessy book, or pick up one of my books, or pick up insert famous railroad author here book. Um, you know, and learn about how people talk about railroads in writing and kind of what expectations have been set for a railroad history. And use that to develop kind of your research style, what level of detail to go into, kind of develop your writing style. If someone were to steal my sentence structure from me, I'm not going to be offended. Now, don't go and like copy and paste a paragraph out of my book, but like, if you want to structure your sentences the same way or kind of structure your research the same way as me, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Um, you know, so to me, it's adding to the greater railroad knowledge that's out there, and I can't possibly be the authority or the only person to research everything out there. So the more people that pick it up, and want to learn and want to write things down and want to make the connections and go out and do the research, the more knowledge is going to be available to everybody else. Um, there's a couple different routes to go in terms of once you've started a project. I would certainly advise, and this is from my own experience, I would certainly advise finding a publisher before you write the book, or before you finish writing the book, because that was my mistake when I started. Was I had a fully complete book and went to go shop it around and realized there wasn't a publisher interested in it.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how I ended up forming my own company 11 years ago, and that's kind of how I took the long, slow road to getting where I now currently am. Um, but I would certainly see if you can talk to a publisher first, and get some guidance for what they think will sell, the direction you should take. A publisher that's been doing this for a while probably has connections they can help you with in terms of who to talk to, and even suggestions on where to get photos or where to get more information, or maybe try this archive, or here's the archivist, or try this museum, or try talk to this random person that has a giant collection of stuff at their house, as so many railroad railroad aficionados have. Um, if somebody ever wanted to do a book on the Morristown area, they'd probably have to call me because I have the railroad's corporate records in my basement. So like, um, so you'd have to find somebody that knew that, and get a hold of me, which is fine. And most people that have that kind of stuff are totally willing to share, but they have to know you're working on it and vice versa. So it's better to reach out before you finish what you're doing and get some guidance from somebody that's got some knowledge in the industry. I wish I'd had that when I first started this, because it probably wouldn't have been as long of a road as it was for me to get from starting to write to being able to sustain myself on it. So,
all very good advice. All very good advice. All hopefully very helpful to those out there who are considering authorship, because I think it's true that the more people that we have out there collecting these stories, the more that we're preserving, and that can absolutely, other than just, oh, that was a cool story, that can have very real world benefits.
mm-hmm.
Speaking of your basement, how is the P&L secondary coming along?
The P&L secondary is slowly coming along. I've been distracted by 1-1 scale stuff recently. But we did take your suggestions for like downtown Lingelstown. And right now the layout's got a whole bunch of paper building foundations laying out. We were just trying out the different formations for the buildings. I think we've got one that we like, but it's going to basically follow exactly what you put together in the in your first railroad here, so our commissioned railroad here. So
yeah. So for those who don't know, Rudy is and his wife Carolyn are the folks who commissioned way back in, I think it was around April of last year. We were streaming the Conrail P&L secondary, which actually I talk about in the recent Railroad Model Craftsman article, and so another reason why it's great to have him on here is somebody who's actually gone through the process of having a layout commissioned and now able to, and especially because you'd already laid down the tracks. Your track work was kind of, you knew you were happy with it, and it was just a matter of trying to ensure that you were good with where you were placing your buildings and how things were coming together scenically.
Yeah, I mean, my layout was built to fit the available space, and therefore the track plan really only had one way it was going to work. It's linear. It's point to point. Like, there was only one place I could fit a yard. One place I could fit a like a big town area. So it kind of, out of necessity, the track ended up where it was. What happened around the track to make it feel like it was real was the thing I was struggling with a little bit, and what Nick did in the simulator was super helpful to help me visualize things, and even things that I already had some ideas about. Nick did something completely different, and I like what he did a lot better than what I had. So yeah, I mean, even just a little thing like you put a little park with a gazebo in the downtown area, and that totally opened up the space from what I was originally envisioning was going to be kind of a straight line of buildings. And just breaking up the street structure and stuff made such a huge difference in the available space that I had, that I think just being able to visualize it in that kind of 3D way, before and operate it before actually putting it buildings to layout, has been super helpful.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It was fun because of those unconventional spaces, especially Lingelstown, where you have this peninsula that ordinarily folks are probably thinking about, how do I get a reverse loop in through here? And instead you kind of have this fork with these two tracks with this big open space in the middle. As soon as I saw that, it's like, oh, that's the town, and why not really go all in on it with the town square and everything? So yeah, that was a fun little piece of unconventional railroading to life of a town to put in. And I'm thinking about that here too, is also what do you, when you're switching an area, what do you want to be staring at? What do you want to be bringing you into the world? And I gotta say, I don't like having the scrapyard here. It's there's nothing wrong with it from a from a functional standpoint. It actually it does make sense because you can reach over to get to the other switches, but it's a scrapyard and it's right in the middle of this town. And I mean, could I make it less prominent with the crane? Yes, but it's icky. I'd rather. I think what I want to consider doing is putting the scrapyard off as one of these. This is tough. So this is supposed to be the freight shed, the team track, and this is there's a manufacturer and then a feed supply building or a feed supply company. But I'm kind of feeling like maybe putting the scrapyard here, which I mean, again, putting the opposite of the freight shed is kind of ugly, but I don't know that it's something I want to be constantly staring at. I have to give that some thought. And that's the type of thing where looking at it on paper, looking at a 2D view, yeah, sure, you can fit it, and it makes sense of something to fit over. I'm almost thinking of putting, I mean, the angle's awkward, because I'd almost put the freight shed and the team track there instead. I'm not sure.
What's hilarious, I have a scrapyard in exactly the same orientation on my layout, right in the foreground, for the same reason, because you can reach over it. It's by default a low industry. There's not much stacked up. It's just kind of a low mounds of things.
You do.
So.
I think it partially depends on kind of what aesthetic one's going for with a layout too. I mean, with yours, there's sort of a, when I was building it, the idea of urban decay was really heavy. And true, this is also technically the 70s, so that I could go that route. I'm just not. I don't want to. I mean, for this one, it's basically an artistic taste. If because we do have some sense of like, yes, there's smoke coming out of this, but my intention was that this was abandoned, or at least it's like an older, smaller mill, hence why it's not rail serviced. But why the station looks good, why I have a city park, because I still want it to feel like this isn't a complete industrial wasteland. I mean, you have 3 or 4 manufacturers just in here, so that would suggest that you're doing a healthy job. So these are the things that one considers when you're figuring out choice of industry, placement of industries, is logistics and even just what looks good.
Yeah, and one of the things to think about too is regional. You know, my layout is central Pennsylvania, which, by the 70s was kind of a rundown, kind of a whole bunch of has-been towns, a lot of places that were big into coal and coal had started to go away, or big into steel and steel had started to go away. If you're modeling D&H, a lot of what D&H ran through was Eastern New York or even New England, Vermont, places that your brain kind of considers to be pretty places. So even if, they were going through the same, downturn in an economy and a downturn in manufacturing in the same era, your brain doesn't register it the same way as you do central Pennsylvania. You still register Vermont as being beautiful no matter what area you're in. So, maybe putting a scrapyard in the foreground of a Vermont layout doesn't make any sense, even if there would have been one there. It just doesn't feel very Vermont-y to have that in the foreground.
Yeah, you feel like you're supposed to have creameries all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, creameries and like, nice Victorian houses and covered bridges, and somehow it's always full.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is the fun. I mean, the fun with that is then you could get into some interesting juxtaposition where, especially if you have a larger layout, or even if you don't, but you're just careful with your scene separation, you could have, I briefly considered it for this, footing, because the D&H did go into Vermont, with having a covered bridge in this area here where we have the trestle. And I opted not to just because we don't have that deep a scene there, but it is something that I contemplated because it did seem like, well, I could be kind of a nice rural New England touch.
I would say this layout to me, looking at how you've kind of built it out here, screams to me the D&H's Washington branch, which was the branch that ran down like the New York Vermont border.
Which is good because that's where the Sharks worked, right?
Yep, they worked that branch. They worked the Washington branch. That was the slate picker job that worked the Washington branch and the Rutland branch. So yeah, this would be right home for them, and this is very much even. I mean, this is the Battenkill Railroad now. That's the Washington branch.
Right, yes.
So it's very much that territory and even this kind of industry, this kind of building. That's very much what you see in places like Cambridge, New York. You probably don't see a car driving through a boxcar like I just watched, but you do see like this kind of very generic square looking brick building, but it's probably 150 years old. Being used as a manufacturing center of some small product somewhere. That's very much that part of New York. So
yeah, just outside Albany. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Carolyn. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, where were we? Just outside of Albany, the antique store. Eagle Bridge.
Eagle Bridge. It's where the Battenkill interchanges with Pan Am.
Yeah, that's what this kind of reminds me of. Is that little area there?
Yep.
Good. I'm glad to hear that it evokes that. And actually, if I get my train back to interchange quick enough, I might do a quick coal run with an RS-11, which will further amplify that comparison.
Very nice. I had to peek in because I'm a lover of sharks, so I wanted to come see what you were doing.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, hopefully, the goal was to build a layout that did them justice. And one just got plowed by another car, but that is what it is.
I've been standing off in the background for about 10 minutes watching, and it looks great.
Good.
Looks really good.
This is I really like this as a play, and I like this as a, I would say, intermediate level switching plan, because I think that for somebody who doesn't, some people love their brain puzzles and really, I mean, your layout is a wonderful brain puzzle for being able to switch, as was famously demonstrated when I did the playtest on it when I was building it a year and a half ago in the sim. But sometimes you want something that's simpler, and with this, all of your sidings on the left side of the layout are facing one way, and then all the sidings on the other side are facing the other way. So you don't go into a town and have to think, okay, I need this car at this point for this move. It actually really flows nicely where you're turning around. You've got your caboose even on the right end. So your caboose is on the right end. You're just pushing cars into where they need to go, pulling the loads out and putting them on the other. So it's really intuitive in that regard.
Yeah, well, and the thing that I think this layout does as well is it feels right for a downtown terminus, like a place you'd end in the middle of a older town. Tracks would all fan out and go to the different industries, and you take one track out of town. So it feels right. Again, going back to New England, that feels right for an older New England town that had had a train going into it.
And it's not as evil as your layout.
Well, my layout was designed as kind of an industrial park, which could have way more complicated tracks than that, because a lot of middle Pennsylvania was undeveloped until they started putting industrial parks in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and tracks went wherever tracks could go.
I know. I just find it funny that it is an absolutely evil puzzle for some people.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it makes sense, but it absolutely rewards multiple playthroughs so that you figure out where you got to put cars when for your runarounds. Whereas this feels like something where even where it's not a roundy, so you're always working your throttle to some extent, but it feels like you could kind of turn your mind off and do what you want. Because I don't feel like, I mean, here we are having this conversation and I'm still able to pay attention to what you're saying and accomplish the work that I said about, which admittedly I could have made more complicated for myself, but still I got enough different sidings in there and so forth. I'm satisfied. This to me is the thing I'm most. Let me briefly change my headlight so I could get a good screenshot. This is my coup de grace. This is my favorite scene of the whole thing, though. This curve with the station and the downtown in the backdrop. That is my favorite here. And just to really properly foam this up as much as we can, let's put a PA4, and then we're really doing the full thing. I don't have any good RNN, or I don't have any good D&H cars, so we are just going to put a few Reading and Northern cars behind just to say we have coaches. And there we go. The full, we got the full D&H foam with the PA and the shark nose. And actually, that's another thing. So Rob, when he designed this layout, the minimum radius is 28 inches, which is pretty wide for HO. So you can anything you have. So if you wanted to switch with a D&H Challenger, have fun, because you could make it fit. And because your runaround is here and your turntable's there, like, you have the room for pretty much whatever size of motive power you want. Like, that was part of why I chose this for this too, is that in some cases, if you were switching with 2 units, you're running out of room for your runarounds, and it's making your life more complicated. But here, it doesn't affect things at all. So, yeah, no, this has been absolutely a blast having you along for the ride and being able to share the real history of this era of D&H railroading while we are modeling the D&H. So, we're gonna run this guy to out of town, and then but we'll take and then we'll do a quick coal run, but we'll take some questions. Got a couple, probably another 10 minutes or so before we sign off for the night. So while we're waiting for some other questions to come in, you mentioned Iowa Interstate as one of the upcoming subjects for you to write about, and the fact that that all of these people who were involved with it are still alive. I mean, 102.
Yeah.
That is so fortunate that you're going to be able to talk to this guy, or are talking to this guy, and able to get all this valuable information.
Yeah, the founder of the railroad in 1984, and he's still around. Yeah, and living on his own.
Nice. Well, that's so. What? I mean, obviously, you don't know what you don't know, but what elements of the Iowa Interstate story, since that kind of ties in what we've done, since we've done the Milan branch previously on this show, what are you most interested to explore? What are your biggest questions that you're hoping that you're looking to answer in the course of writing this book?
So the Iowa Interstate's an interesting case in that it was, it was originally the Rock Island's main across Iowa, and Rock Island couldn't make it work, and then the Iowa Railroad couldn't make it work, and then the Iowa Interstate was formed, and they almost couldn't make it work for the first 9 years or so. So it's a case of, what finally worked? How did they finally make this happen after, really 25, 30 years of the Rock Island, and then, the Iowa Railroad and a couple other, operators all struggling with it to make it happen. There's a success story there. Obviously, the Iowa Interstate's a thriving company now, but in 91 they almost, closed the doors. So, I think it's going to be an interesting study to find out, and that's the why that you can only get from another person. I can get, I've got the whole history. Usually when I start writing a book, I write out my own, just like the bland history that nobody would ever read. I just write out, okay, this happened on this date, and then this happened on this date, and then this happened on this date, and like, just enough that I have myself a framework to then ask questions, or develop the interviews, or ask somebody why, or were you involved in this? This thing happened here. Did you have a part of that? Or whatever. So I'm interested to find out, and I've started, so I know a little bit of this already. I've talked to a couple people already about what happened to turn it from, the Rock Island and their horrendous bankruptcy in the late 70s, early 80s, to a thriving, railroad that's out there buying brand new GEs today. So.
And honestly, the Rock Island, plenty's been written on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really, as a East Coast guy, have a great knowledge of it other than it was big, it had tons of lines, it failed in spectacular fashion. So even something that could kind of talk about the pieces that needed to be picked up as in those early chapters is going to be really interesting in its own right.
So there is a fantastic book by a gentleman that you presumably met this past week, by H. Roger Grant, on the Rock Island.
The Rock Island line, yes.
Yes. That book has been absolutely integral to what I'm working on. That's what I mean about somebody writing stuff down while you have the opportunity to do so, because Roger probably didn't write that book intending for somebody else to come along and write a book on the Iowa Interstate after the fact. But he had the opportunity to write that book and talk to a lot of people that were involved, and so he did. And now here I am 15 years later after he wrote that, kind of hacking writing something about the next railroad that took the line over, and suddenly his research is relevant. Just like if somebody was going to turn around and write a book on, the NS Sunbury line, well, they probably want to look at my D&H book. That was the D&H main that CP sold them in 2014. So that's why I think some of the preservation work that we do in writing is important beyond what I've written about. I'm not going to be able to foresee whatever use is going to be for my book, but I think getting it written down while I have the opportunity to talk to these people and get the stories on paper is super important.
To that point about having a good use or not being able to predict the uses of these books, what are some stories that you've heard coming off of the D&H book? I mean, I heard a lot of praise this past weekend at the conference that we went to. A lot of people were praising him over this book. But other than kind of general praise, what are some ways in which your books have come around to you, or stories about your books have come around to you in ways that you didn't expect?
Oh man, I've had the kind of weird ones where people stand at the table in Springfield and waiting to talk to me, and they got up to me and they go, "I just wanted to shake the hand of an actual author," and I was like, okay. I had those weird ones, but I've also had I had a museum out in, I think it was the Western Pacific Museum, maybe. I don't remember. Don't quote me on what museum it was. It was a museum out west somewhere that contacted me about a book we did on Pullman dining car operations. And was like, "Oh yeah, we're doing an exhibit in our diner, and we'd like some resources, and we saw your book. Is there any way we can like reproduce the menus or like some of the pictures for the place settings so we can put it in a museum and like actually exhibit to the public?" So I was able to get to the authors and coordinate that happening. So that wasn't ever something that we envisioned when we put the book out, that a museum was going to want to exhibit the contents of the book to the public. But like, that's the kind of stuff we try to put out is stuff that I guess probably should be exhibited to the public, or is in the right context could be educational in a museum setting. So there's been I've gotten all kinds of questions from museums and inquiries from researchers doing research on specific locomotives. I mean, I've done two books on caboose. I did a book on Conrail cabooses, and then just earlier this year I did a book on D&H cabooses. And the amount of researchers that have contacted me about, specifically about like, "Hey, I have Conrail caboose XYZ. What do you know about this feature on it or this part of it or whatever. And I'm fortunate that I'm able to provide all of those resources. A lot of the stuff that I got for those books, and maybe didn't end up in the book, but like, I had a guy reach out to me a couple years ago, who's now a friend of mine as a result of this, who had bought a Conrail caboose and needed a couple windows, and was like, "Do you know of?" He said, I found the original manufacturer, but they don't have the diagrams, so they don't know. Like, do you have any diagrams that show the windows and stuff? I was like, well, yeah, actually, here's all the original Conrail engineering diagrams for the window frames, and from that company, I have copies of them. The company didn't have them anymore, but I did. And Nick, I saw that.
You saw nothing. Nobody saw anything. That was a misunderstanding of game physics. That is all. Anyway.
But yeah, so like I was able to give him and the company the original drawings to manufacture new window frames for a caboose from the 1980s.
That's awesome.
Because it's just something that I came across in the course of my research, and those weren't in the book, but like I just have all this information that I hang on to it, and and that's turned into a whole thing where he's giving me parts now for my caboose that I have, and he's now involved in Operation Toy Train, and like it's just, again, the connections you make, but a lot of that's through a lot of my connections are through my books, and people that reach out to me either before or after the book comes out and say, hey, either do you have this information, or hey, I have information, do you want it? And that's been really cool to see kind of where the information that I put out ends up and what comes back to me as a result of that.
And I'm guessing that there's no such thing as too much information, because you never know when you or somebody else is going to be writing a book where that might be really important to have on hand.
Yeah, it's funny. Carolyn makes fun of me. My wife Carolyn makes fun of me because I just sometimes buy things that appear random, even for me. Like I'll tell her I'll buy something at a train show and be like, I don't know what I'm gonna use this for, but I'm sure I'll use it at some point. Maybe, I don't know, I was still in college, maybe 10 years ago, I bought a Milwaukee Road timetable from the 30s. And I was like, whatever. I don't have anything on Milwaukee Road, so I might as well buy one thing so I have something to reference if I need it. And 7 years later, I get approached with a book on the Milwaukee Road in the 30s. And it was, all the photos were taken, totally by chance, but all the photos were taken in the time span that timetable covered. It was like a 1932 timetable or something, and the photos were all taken in 32. And there's a great ad that's the center spread of that timetable that we actually used the ad from the timetable as the front cover of the book.
Well, that's awesome.
So like having a library of things to pull from. Again, I understand that I do this for a living. I can expense a lot of that on the company, and I'm fortunate to be able to do that. Not everybody has the amount of disposable income that I don't call it disposable. For me, it's actually a business write-off. But like, the amount of income that I have to pour into buying random things like that. But there's so many times that somebody's been like, hey, I'm going to do a book on this thing. Do you have any information? I'm like, well, yeah, actually, here's the only original copy of XYZ that I happen to have.
Wow.
Or, or whatever it is. So, having a library of stuff has been super, super helpful in a lot of cases. And I've been, I have no problem sharing that. If somebody, there's nothing here that I'm like, consider proprietary rare knowledge. If somebody calls me and they're like, hey, do you have a Conrail ZTS map of XYZ location? I'll go in the basement and look, and if I have one, I'll scan it and send it to you. I don't care, slides and photos and just the amount of stuff I have I've accumulated. It's part of the reason I now have a caboose, because I needed to find some places to start storing things, because they're not all going to keep fitting in the house. But yeah, just having some of that stuff on hand, or even knowing where to get some of it if I don't have it myself, has been hugely helpful. Um, in terms of resources. Yeah, Ron mentioned in the chat, official guides are a treasure. Um, locomotive and car cyclopedias. I have a pretty full library from the 40s to present. Those are hugely helpful. I'm trying to think of what other certain periodicals from certain eras are usually useful. Um, if you're doing research on rosters and stuff, Extra 220 South was the magazine for that. If you've got, I'm fortunate that we've got a full set of them up at Port Jervis that I can access if I need them. So, there's all kinds of stuff like that though. That, the more material you have available to you, the more you can kind of expand on whatever research you're doing, because you can start looking at other sources and you can start figuring out what's out there. And there's kind of two answers to that question, which is okay, is there stuff here? If yes, cool, I have more information. If not, I'm really onto something because there's no other information on it.
Right.
You know?
One of the senses of discovery is
Yeah.
knowing where there isn't already something.
Yeah. Part of discovery is discovering there isn't anything to discover. Okay, I really have found something that does not otherwise exist.
It's great that you're able to explore that though, and you recognize the value of it when you find it.
That's where I got to with the D&H stuff. I mean, starting to look at books and things that have been previously published, and there just isn't. There's just nothing else out there. So that was one of the reasons I tackled that book, because I kept looking around and kept trying to find things, and I just as soon as the D&H got acquired by Guilford in '84, any information on the railroad just ceased. Even what was there prior to that was limited. So, realizing that you're onto something that has not been otherwise covered is an interesting discovery in its own. And that's why I have an entire filing cabinet drawer now full of actual D&H paperwork, because there's nothing else published. There's no other books to reference or anything else. So I was digging through actual, company records and timetables, and I was fortunate again that some of the guys that I talked to had saved things. They just gave it to me and said, "Here, take it." So I have an entire filing cabinet drawer now full of internal correspondence and timetables and internal documents and stuff that nobody else has about the D&H. So
Mean Metal Mike is asking when the D&H got Challengers. I want to say the 30s.
I want to say 40 was the first order, but I can probably confirm that really quick because I have the Steam book open in front of me.
Good job, Mike. You've sent Rudy to the research archives.
Yeah.
Good job. Thumbs up. So while Rudy is looking that up, those watching closely noticed that I saved myself a little bit of time doing that runaround move. So we're going to have this guy leaving town. We're going to end on a D&H passenger train that's going to go through the scene. We'll call it at that, just because I can't... the sharks were the main fun, but I can't resist the opportunity to drive a PA through the scene as well. Then I'll have really covered everything that I need to with this layout.
So the first order of 20 Challengers were delivered in 1940. And then there were 15 more built in 42, and the last 5 were built in 46. There were 40 total.
And the question came in, didn't the Gettysburg have D&H RS diesels? No, those were not D&H, but they also weren't RSs. They were, well, there were chop-nose Jeep 7s, which were Western Maryland.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But no, I'm not thinking of of where you're coming at with D&H on that one.
No, I don't think they were D&H. I remember Knox and Kane did, but I don't think D&H. I don't think Gettysburg did.
Oh, right. We're talking. I think of. Yeah. Yeah, they are kind of the same thing in certain regards. Right, that's 2 trains we got successfully run through here, with the third being the simplest. Problem I find with doing this is almost every time I build one of these, I'm like, yeah, I could see building that layout. I could see building that layout in real life. I set about this whole process to kind of help me to choose what I'm actually going to build in real life, and all it tells me is I want to build everything.
Me, Metal Mike, yes, the Western Maryland also had Challengers, but theirs, I believe, were Baldwin. The D&Hs were built by Alco.
Let's see. I need some coach material. I suppose I could be kind of anachronistic and run some. Oh no, those are even ugly. Those amphitheats.
Oh God.
Oh, okay. Well, close enough. So we'll put a few CP streamline coaches.
There's a D&H PA with a couple of like first generation Amtrak cars and a couple of CP cars behind it. Maybe an MBTA coach would be accurate for a mid 70s Adirondack.
Yeah, I've got one of those things, so I'm going with the one thing that I have, which are the CP coaches.
Yeah.
So just to be able to say like, hey, here's what it looks like in doing the passenger thing. Oh, that's a nice
There
build.
you go.
Yo. So we'll stand on the platform and have our Adirondack come into town.
I throw a CPF unit in front of the PA too for some reason.
If only I had one of those. Wish I did.
I have a photo. I don't think it made it in the book actually, because it's not a great photo, but there's a shot somewhere that I have of a CP F7 with a D&H RS11 low nose and a leading a RS3 on the Adirondack. So it's a CP F7, a low nose RS11, a D&H RS11, and a low nose and a steam generator equipped D&H RS3 pulling the Adirondack.
That's
some weird things happened up there in Canada in the 70s. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, their CP was starving for power, and so would lease anything that rolled. I mean, they leased from C&O. They leased Bessemer F units, which is the one that always gets me.
Yeah.
That's the one I look at and go, okay, that is really starved if that's where you're going for your power. I love it and then during the 90s when they would lease Go Transit and Via Rail passenger locomotives for freight.
Yes.
There's some great YouTube videos on that. Okay. Leaving
so
town.
Bessemer F units barely count as power.
That is true in some regards. How many Rapido F units do you have, or not F units, but Alco PAs do you have on pre-order? Do you have
0.
any? No?
0. Because I can't fathom what I would do with a PA on my switching layout.
That is true. It would... that sometimes having your layout limit what you can run is good. A lesson I have not yet learned.
So I am limited, but not, because I model early Conrail, so I can kind of buy just about anything else. So like right now, my layout's got a CN M420 on it and a Frisco U25B on it, because Conrail leased both of those in '78.
That makes sense. But so you've got perfect rationale for it.
Yeah.
Especially given the time frame that you're working with of '79.
Yeah. So, I can't justify a PA, but that you just ran out at the end of the track. But I can justify just about anything else in the Northeast. I'm thinking about if somebody ever does a Banger and a Roostic Jeep in HO, I might have to get one of them too. So,
well, that would be fun.
Conrail leased those for years. So,
well, that takes it. We got not just one, not just two, but three trains demonstrated on this layout today. This is again the Eastbrook branch, as done up in Delaware and Hudson for HO scale, designed by Rob Chant of Journal of Model Railroad Design. You can go to jomrd.com and see his track plans there, including this one. This will be available eventually on greattrainlayouts.com, and if you want to download some of the other layouts you've seen on our live streams, you can go there too. Most recently, we released one that hasn't been seen on live stream called Copperwort, British industrial switching layout where you get to make beer. That one is available on there. And if you want to support the work that I do here on the live streams, either A, you can become a patron over on Patreon, or B, you can commission me to help design your train layout. I'd be more than happy to work with you on that front. Our special guest today has been Mr. Rudy Gardley. Rudy, thank you so much for being on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And so, with that, we will sign off. But it's been great to have you guys, and look forward to seeing you next month. The calendar of upcoming episodes also on greattrainlayouts.com. Good night.